Tonight, we travel to the Rhineland abbeys in the winter of 850, when a medical text known as the Lorscher Arsnebuch is believed to have been copied by lamplight. It is the year 850 in the Benedictine Abbey of Lorsch on the Borgstrasse. A monk rises in the darkness before dawn, his breath visible in the unheated cell. The bell for Matins will sound soon, summoning him to the church of St. Nazarius, said to have been founded 86 years earlier in the time of Charlemagne. The day ahead will unfold according to the rule of St. Benedict, measured in 7 canonical hours, from this darkness until the great silence falls after Compline. You are standing in the dormitory of Lorsch Abbey in the winter of 850, and the night watchman's wooden board has begun to strike its measured rhythm through the darkness. The metallic taste of cold air fills your mouth as you lie on your narrow pallet, the straw beneath you compressed by months of sleeping bodies, and you recognize the vigilia calling the community to matins in the church below. Around you, the monks of St. Nazarius' monastery stir in their day clothes, for no fire has ever been permitted in this long hall where Benedict's rule demands common sleeping until the later centuries change such ways. The winter night in the Rhineland lasts approximately 15 hours at the winter solstice, and you have slept perhaps 4 of them since Compline ended the day's offices. The scrape of sandals on stone reaches your ears as the first brothers find their way to the covered passage that protects them from the weather outside. You pull your woolen cloak more tightly across your shoulders, feeling the weight of fabric, still holding yesterday's warmth against your skin, and you follow the others through the darkness of the corridor connecting dormitory to church. The passage was built to shield the monks of Lorsch from rain and snow as they made this journey 8 times each day, and its stones are smooth beneath your feet from generations of bare and sandaled soles. Somewhere ahead, a brother stumbles and mutters a brief prayer, his voice absorbed by the close walls around you. The church opens before you like a cavern of deeper darkness, its stone vault still holding the residue of incense from Vespers the evening before. The single point of candle flame reflected in polished marble columns draws your eye toward the sanctuary, where the cantor has already begun his work of illumination. He holds a lantern close to the large antiphonary, his breath visible in the chill air as he prepares to lead the chanting that will carry the community through the next 2 hours. The church at Lorsch had nocturnal lighting from oil lamps and candles, but at this hour only the great Easter candle burns, its flame newly transferred to a lesser wick for the purpose of these winter matins. You find your place in the choir stalls, and around you the community gathers, blowing on their fingers in the cold, their exhalations rising like faint smoke in the dimness. The Monastery of Lorsch was founded around 764 CE as a Benedictine abbey dedicated to St. Nazarius, and you feel the weight of those 86 years in every stone that surrounds you now. Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, confirmed and expanded Lorsch's privileges, granting the abbey imperial protection that elevated its abbot to the status of Reichsabbot, directly subject to the emperor himself. This protection brought wealth and obligation in equal measure, and the community you join in the darkness numbers perhaps 40 souls, each bound by the same rule that governs your own rising and kneeling and chanting. The cantor raises his voice, and the first nocturne begins with Psalm 3, sung in Gregorian chant in the dark, the ancient Hebrew words translated into Latin melody that the monks of St. Nazarius' house have preserved through generations. The resonance of male voices in a stone vault at 3:00 a.m. fills the space above you, the sound seeming to originate from the architecture itself rather than from any individual throat. You have memorized the entire Psalter of 150 psalms as part of your training, as every monk here was expected to do, and the words of Psalm 3 rise from memory without effort. Asterisk domine, quid multiplicati sunt qui tribulant me. Asterisk, the rule of St. Benedict prescribes matins, which the older tradition names vigils, to begin after midnight, typically around 2:00 a.m. in winter, and the community has gathered in this hour of deepest cold to fulfill the obligation that defines their common life. Matins consists of nocturnes with psalms, lessons, and responsories lasting up to 2 hours, and you settle your body for the duration, feeling the ache of knees against unforgiving floor during prolonged kneeling that will come before the office ends. A senior monk steps forward to the lectern, and lamplight catches the weathered skin of his hands as he opens the Book of Job. His voice carrying in the stone vault, he begins to read from the sufferings of that ancient figure, the Latin cadences falling like slow water into the silence between phrases. The Lorcher Arsnebuch was produced around 800 CE, likely under Abbot Richbod of the Imperial Abbey, and the same community probably harbored brothers who copied manuscripts, mixed medicines, and preserved classical learning in their Scriptorium. The Lorcher Codex, the Codex Laurishamensis, records the abbey's extensive property holdings from this period, estates scattered across the Rhineland and beyond that sustain the very stones and bread and parchment that make this night office possible. The abbot who holds the status of Reichsabbot administers these holdings with the same attention to detail that the cantor brings to his antiphonary. The distant hoot of owls from the abbey woods reaches you between verses, the sound entering through some high window or gap in the masonry where the outside world persists despite the enclosure of monastic life. You are standing at the threshold of the third nocturne now, the psalms accumulating like layers of sediment, each one depositing its particular burden of praise or lament upon the consciousness of the community. The smell of beeswax and extinguished rushlights mingles with the cold, the earlier lamps having burned down to nothing while the great candle continues its steady diminishment. The monks slept in dormitories in common, not in private cells, until the later Middle Ages transformed these arrangements, and the warmth of those shared bodies still lingers in your memory as your knees find the stone floor once more. The cantor signals the beginning of the Misera, and the community makes full prostrations on the stone floor during the recitation of Psalm 51, the ancient penitential cry that breaks the rhythm of standing and sitting that has governed the office thus far. You extend your arms in the form of a cross, your forehead pressing against the smooth flags where countless brothers have pressed before you, and the words come slowly through the physical effort of this posture. Asterisk misera me, Deus, secundum magnam misericordiam tuam. Asterisk, the night office included the recitation of the misera with prostrations as a regular feature of monastic discipline, and you feel the blood shifting in your body, the pressure of stone against your chest, the slow burn of maintained effort that the rule demands at this hour when the body most desires horizontal rest. The church bells at Lorsch were cast from bronze alloy, and though the surviving bells that date to the 11th century are still centuries from their casting, you know the sound that will eventually ring from this tower, the same bronze voice that calls monks to the same offices in ages yet to come. The Carolingian Torhall, the gatehouse at Lorsch, built around 800 CE, remains one of the few fully preserved buildings from the Carolingian period, and though it does not yet exist in this winter of 850, the hands that will raise its arches are perhaps being trained even now in the abbey's workshops, the same hands that copied the Lorcher Arsnebuch under Abbot Richbod's direction. The community rises from its prostrations, the misera concluded, and the senior monk returns to his lectern for the final lesson of the night. You are standing in the choir stall, though the standing has become less certain, your body finding its balance through habit rather than active intention. The cantor's lantern flickers as the oil within it nears exhaustion, and the single point of candle flame reflected in polished marble columns seems to multiply in your vision, the polished stone returning light from surfaces you had not previously distinguished in the darkness. The scrape of sandals on stone stairs has ceased, all the community now gathered, and the distant hoot of owls from the abbey woods seems closer, as if the birds have descended to investigate the light that persists in this building when all others have surrendered to night. The final responsory rises and falls, the antiphon closing upon itself like a hand folding closed, and you feel the collective exhalation of the community as the office reaches its term. Louis the Pious confirmed and expanded Lorsch's privileges, and the imperial protection he extended helped preserve this community through the centuries. The abbot of Lorsch held the status of Reichsabbot, directly subject to the emperor, and this status meant that the night watchman who struck his wooden board, the cantor who lit the great candle, the senior monk who read from Job, all served a sovereignty that transcended the local and the immediate. Community disperses toward the covered passage, the return journey to the dormitory undertaken in a silence deeper than that of the outward way, for now the obligation is fulfilled, and the body may legitimately seek the rest that the rule will permit, until Prime calls them again to the church. The metallic taste of cold air in the dormitory before rising will be forgotten in the warmth of accumulated bodies, the straw pallets yielding to the weight of monks who have completed their vigil. You follow the others through the passage, your hand finding the familiar groove in the stone wall where generations have steadied themselves in this same darkness. The dormitory receives you like a held breath, the bodies already warming the enclosed air, the absence of fire still absolute, the rule's prohibition undiminished by the cold that has penetrated your joints during the prostrations of the miserer. You find your pallet, the straw compressed beneath you in the shape of your own sleeping form, and you lie down still in your day clothes, the woolen cloak spreading over you like a second body. The ache of knees against unforgiving floor during prolonged kneeling begins to dissipate, the blood finding its ordinary channels, the stone's impression fading from the skin, though perhaps not from the deeper tissues where such impressions accumulate over years of repetition. The smell of beeswax and extinguished rushlights clings to your hands, to the fabric of your sleeve where you held the stall's wooden edge, and this scent will accompany you into the half-sleep that now becomes permissible. The distant hoot of owls from the abbey woods persists, or perhaps you hear it now in memory, the boundary between perception and recollection softening as the body descends toward rest. The cantor's voice, the senior monk's reading, the collective chant of Psalm 3 that opened the office, all continue somewhere beneath the threshold of active attention, a murmur of sound that does not cease but merely changes register. You are lying in the dormitory of Lorsch Abbey, and the night continues around you, the darkness outside absolute, the cold increasing toward the dawn that remains hours distant. The straw beneath you yields and does not yield, the compression of months having created a surface that accepts the body without fully embracing it. The scrape of sandals on stone, stairs in absolute darkness, will sound again, and again, and again, through the remaining hours of this winter night, and through all the winter nights that the monks of St. Nazarius' house will observe until the later Middle Ages alter their arrangements and permit the privacy of cells. You are lying among brothers whose names you know, and whose breathing you can now distinguish in the darkness, each a particular rhythm, each a particular weight upon the air of this long hall. The rule of St. Benedict prescribes Matins to begin after midnight, typically around 2:00 a.m. in winter, and you have fulfilled this prescription, have risen and descended, and chanted and knelt, and prostrated, and risen again and returned, the cycle complete until the next Vigilia calls the community once more. You are aware of your own breathing, of the rise and fall of your chest beneath the woolen cloak, of the slowing of your heart as the exertion of the office releases its hold upon your body. The Lorscher Arsnebuch was produced around 800 CE under Abbot Richbod of the Imperial Abbey. and somewhere in the Scriptorium, the brothers who copied that work may now be resting, or may yet be working by lamplight, their dedication to the preservation of knowledge, transcending the ordinary rhythms of sleep and waking. The Carolingian Torhal at Lorsch, built around 900 CE, remains one of the few fully preserved buildings from the Carolingian period, and this future fact settles into your consciousness like a stone into water, the ripples of its implication spreading outward without urgency. The Lorscher Codex records the abbey's extensive property holdings from this period, the estates that sustain this community and will sustain it through the centuries that separate your own lying here from the preservation of that gatehouse. The monks were expected to memorize the entire Psalter of 150 psalms as part of their training, and the psalms now move through your half-conscious mind without deliberate recitation, the words arising and falling like the breathing of the brothers around you, like the distant hoot of owls from the abbey woods that may be audible still, or maybe only the persistence of sound in the chambers of the ear. The darkness is complete. The cold is merely cold, no longer the active adversary that it was during the procession to church, and the standing in choir, and the kneeling for the prostrations of the miser. You are lying in the dormitory at Lorsch, and the night continues, and the community sleeps around you in its common arrangement, the later Middle Ages still distant with their transformations and their privacies. The abbot who holds the status of Reichsabbot sleeps in his own place within this hall, his authority set aside for these hours of common rest, his body subject to the same cold, and the same straw, and the same gradual descent toward dreams. The smell of beeswax and extinguished rushlights has faded, or your perception of it has faded, the olfactory sense withdrawing its attention as the body moves deeper into the state that precedes sleep. The cantor who led the chanting, holding a lantern to read from the large antiphonary, has found his own rest, his voice silent, his breath now joining the collective respiration of the dormitory. The night office included the recitation of the Misra with prostrations, and your body retains some trace of that physical devotion, some settling of the muscles into the configuration of rest after the exertion of deliberate posture. The covered passage that protects from weather lies empty, the connection between dormitory and church traversed in both directions, and now abandoned to the cold that fills it without opposition. You are lying still. The breathing around you continues, each brother a particular rhythm, the collective sound like water moving over stones in some stream that flows without haste and without destination. The cold moves across your face like a slow hand, the air in the dormitory not still, but circulating in currents too gentle to be called drafts, merely the movement of atmosphere in an enclosed space populated by breathing bodies. The distant hoot of owls from the abbey woods has ceased, or has moved beyond the range of your hearing, the birds completing their nocturnal business as the monks have completed theirs. The darkness is not empty. It contains the breathing, the residual warmth, the accumulated presence of bodies that have risen and returned, that will rise again when the next vigilia sounds its wooden rhythm through the winter night. The metallic taste of cold air has given way to no taste at all, the mouth relaxed, the breathing through the nose or through the slightly parted lips occurring without the attention that would make it conscious, would make it deliberate, would keep you awake in the vigil that is no longer required. The straw beneath you accepts your weight without comment, without resistance, the compressed surface having become familiar through months of repetition, through the same lying down and rising that constitutes the monastic day. The smell of beeswax and extinguished rushlights has faded to nothing, or to something so subtle that only the deepest breathing, the most relaxed attention, could perceive it, and you are no longer attending in that way, are no longer perceiving in that way, are no longer present in the manner that the office demanded and that the dormitory now releases. The darkness that contains all hours begins to release its hold upon the dormitory of Lorsch Abbey. You are lying still upon your straw pallet, and the breathing of the monks around you continues in its measured rhythm, and the winter night continues in its particular persistence, and the abbey continues in its stone endurance, and the community continues in its ancient discipline. The hour of prime approaches, that first office of the day which Benedict established to greet the returning light. In winter, this hour falls at approximately 6 o'clock, when the sky above the Rhine Valley remains the color of cooled ash. In summer, the same office begins an hour earlier at 5, when the first warmth has already begun to stir the orchards beyond the abbey walls. The ora et labora, the prayer and work that Saint Benedict decreed as the double structure of monastic life, prepares to turn from its night of rest toward the labor of the new day. A single bell begins to sound from the tower above the crossing. The sound moves through the cold air of the dormitory in slow waves, each stroke distinct from the last, each vibration lingering until the next arrives to displace it. You rise from your pallet, and the wool blanket falls away from your shoulders, and the cold air of the unheated dormitory moves across the sleep-warmed skin of your neck. Around you, the other monks are rising also, their movements deliberate and unhurried, their bare feet finding the stone floor in the practiced manner of years. The black habit that serves as the monk's day clothes hangs upon a peg beside your pallet, and you lift it over your head, and the heavy wool settles around your body with the familiar weight of daily assumption. The cucula, that fuller garment reserved for the choir, remains folded upon the shelf, to be donned only for the sung offices. The scapula, that apron-like cloth that protects the habit during work, you will fasten later, when the chapter meeting has concluded and the assignments of the day have been distributed. The monks move through the passage that leads from the dormitory to the south transept of the church. The stone walls of this passage have been worn smooth by centuries of bare feet passing in darkness, and the cold of the stone seeps upward through the soles of your feet as you walk. The church awaits in its vast stillness, the columns of the nave rising toward the vault in shapes barely discernible in the light of the few lamps that have been lit. The community gathers in the choir stalls, and the cantor raises his voice in the first note of prime, that office which marks the beginning of the day's proper observance. The monks respond in unison, their voices low and measured, the Latin syllables moving through the cold air in columns of sound that rise toward the vault and dissipate there among the shadows. The light of winter dawn begins to filter through the round-arched windows of the east wall. The quality of this light is particular to the season, a pale diffusion that seems to arrive from a great distance, having lost all warmth in its passage through the frozen atmosphere. The stone of the window embrasures catches this light and holds it, so that the arches themselves appear to glow with a faint luminosity, while the spaces between them remain in shadow. You are standing in the choir stall, and the psalm continues around you, and the light continues to strengthen upon the floor of the nave, and the cold continues to hold the church in its winter grasp. The ora et labora has begun its daily cycle, and the first portion, the ora, moves toward its completion as the sun approaches the horizon beyond the abbey walls. Prime concludes with the final collect, and the monks rise from their stalls in the same order in which they have knelt. The community moves toward the door that leads to the cloister, and the transition from the stone flooring of the church to the wooden threshold of the chapter house passage produces a particular echo that each monk recognizes without remarking upon it. The chapter house at Lorsch was located in the east range of the cloister, and the light that has begun to enter the church now falls also upon the arcades of this walk, so that the columns cast long shadows across the paving of the cloister garth. The cloister garth was enclosed by covered walks on 4 sides, and the monks move along the north walk now, their footsteps soft upon the stone, their habits dark against the pale light of the sky that is visible above the roofline of the east range. The chapter house door stands open, and the monks enter in order of seniority, the novices last, the abbot first. The room is rectangular, its vault supported by a single central column from which the ribs radiate like the ribs of a leaf. The abbot takes his seat upon the raised bench at the eastern end, and the monks arrange themselves upon the stone benches that line the walls. The light enters the chapter house through the east windows, and this pale winter dawn falls upon the stone of the walls, and upon the faces of the monks, and upon the abbot's staff where it rests against the bench. The quality of this light is insufficient to warm the room, and the cold of the night persists here, held within the stone as the monks hold their silence in the moments before the meeting begins. The abbot speaks the opening versicle, and the community responds. The chapter meeting of the Benedictine rule serves multiple purposes, and the first of these is the reading of a portion of the rule itself, so that the monks may be continually reminded of the foundation upon which their common life rests. The reader stands at the lectern, and his voice moves through the cold air of the chapter house in the same measured tones that have carried the Psalms of Prime. The passage for this day concerns the instruments of good works, those 72 precepts that Saint Benedict set down as the practical shape of monastic observance. The monks listen in the particular silence of many men working in proximity without speech, a silence that is not empty but filled with the concentration of attention, the discipline of presence. The reading concludes, and the abbot invites the community to speak of matters that concern the common life. A monk rises from his bench, a monk whose name you have known since your arrival at Lorsch, a monk who has kept the offices with you through many winters. He confesses to speaking during the Great Silence, that period from Compline until Prime during which the rule forbids all unnecessary speech. The circumstances emerge in his brief account. A novice who had fallen ill in the night, a question asked in concern, a word spoken when gesture would have sufficed. The fault is minor, but the discipline is exact, and the abbot assigns his penance. Extra psalms to be sung in the private prayer of the afternoon, a small burden that will remind the monk of the boundary he has crossed. The confession is made publicly, as the rule commands, and the penance is assigned publicly, so that all may understand the standard that binds them and the mercy that tempers its application. Other matters follow. The state of the harvest stores, the need for repairs to the aqueduct that brings water from the spring, the arrival of a messenger from the Monastery of Fulda. The Monastery of Fulda was founded in 744 by Sturmius on commission from Boniface, and it stands now as one of the great houses of the Frankish realm, its Scriptorium having become one of the most important by the late 8th century. The messenger brings word of a manuscript that Fulda seeks to borrow, a text of Augustine's commentary upon the Psalms that the Lorsch Library holds in its collection. The librarian, who sits upon a bench near the abbot, inclines his head in acknowledgement of the request, and the matter is noted for later consideration. The abbot now turns to the distribution of work assignments for the day. The Benedictine rule divides the day into the ora et labora, and the second portion, the labora, must now be organized so that each monk may contribute to the sustenance and operation of the community. The abbot speaks of the tasks that await: the copying of texts in the Scriptorium, the preparation of medicines in the Infirmary, the brewing of beer in the Abbey brewery, the assembly of a new choir for the gospel book that the house has undertaken. The Scriptorium at Lorsch produced the Codex Aureus, a lavish gospel book, and the tradition of fine production continues in the work of the present generation of scribes. The librarian rises when the abbot names the Scriptorium, and he moves to the table where the materials of his office have been arranged. He distributes parchment quires to copyists, assign new texts, his movements deliberate, as he matches each monk to the work that suits his skill. The quires, gatherings of several bifolia folded and arranged for binding, pass from his hands to those of the copyists who will fill them with the texts of the fathers or the scriptures or the medical recipes that the community preserves. The Lorcher Arsnebuch contains 482 recipes and is the oldest preserved German medical book, and the copying of such texts ensures their survival against the decay of time and the accidents of fortune. You receive your assignment with the others, and the quire of parchment that passes into your hands carries the slight warmth of having rested near the librarian's body. The skin is prepared, scraped thin, ruled with the faint lines that will guide your pen. The work of the day begins to take its shape around you, each monk moving toward the task that has been assigned, each habit dark against the pale light that now fills the chapter house through the east windows. The monks disperse from the chapter house in the order that their work demands. Some move toward the church, where the first mass of the day is offered inside chapels by priests of the community, each priest celebrating at a separate altar so that the monks may assist and receive according to their need. The sound of these celebrations moves through the church in overlapping murmurs, the Latin of the canon whispered in one chapel while the communion antiphon is sung in another. You are walking through the cloister, and the light has strengthened now upon the arcades, and the shadows of the columns have shortened upon the paving stones, and the cold air moves across your face with the faint movement of a breeze that has entered from the world beyond the abbey walls. The central space of the garth lies open to the sky, a rectangle of winter grass and frozen earth that the monks traverse on their paths between the ranges. The well in the cloister provided water for washing and brewing, and you pause at the well now, and the cold water from the well on sleep-rough faces brings a shock of wakefulness that the night has not fully dispelled. The water is drawn in a wooden bucket, and the rope creaks in the wellhead as the bucket descends, and the sound of the water striking the surface below arrives after a delay that the depth of the well creates. You cup the water in your hands, and the cold moves through your fingers, and you raise the water to your face, and the last residue of sleep departs with the physical clarity of the sensation. The taste of thin barley gruel with salt at the morning meal awaits in the refectory, but that meal is still distant, and the work of the day must begin before the body receives its first sustenance. The refectory reading began at the principal meal, not at breakfast, which was frugal, and the thin gruel that you will consume will be taken in silence, without the consolation of the text that accompanies the later dinner. You move toward the range of buildings that houses the Scriptorium, and your footsteps change from stone to wooden flooring at the chapter house threshold, and the echo of this transition marks your passage from the public spaces of the cloister to the working interior of the house. The Scriptorium occupies the upper floor of the east range, above the warming room and the library proper. The light enters here through windows that face both the cloister garth and the world beyond the abbey walls, and the quality of this light is sufficient for the close work that the copyists undertake. You are standing at a writing desk, and the quire of parchment lies before you, and the inkhorn stands at your right hand, and the penknife rests upon the board where you will shape your reed pen. Around you, the other copyists have taken their places, and the particular silence of many men working in proximity, without speech, settles upon the room like a garment that each has donned without remarking upon its assumption. The sound of parchment being ruled with lead point moves through the Scriptorium as the copyists prepare their pages. The lead point, that soft metal stylus that leaves a faint grey line upon the prepared skin, moves across the surface in measured intervals, creating the horizontal guides that will govern the script and the vertical boundaries that will contain it. The sound is slight, a scratching that will be lost in any environment less attentive to silence, but in the Scriptorium it is audible, a component of the acoustic texture that the copyists inhabit as they work. You are ruling your own page now, and the lead moves beneath your fingers, and the lines emerge upon the parchment in their regular succession. and the page prepares itself to receive the text that your pen will inscribe. A novice enters the Scriptorium from the stair that descends to the lower floor. He carries the fresh-made ink in a horn container that he has filled at the fire where the ingredients were mixed. The warming room, the Calefactorium, was permitted only in winter, typically from November to Easter, and its fire serves both to warm the hands of the copyists and to provide the heat necessary for certain preparations. The novice moves among the desks, distributing the ink according to the needs of each copyist, and his movements are careful, for the spilling of ink upon a prepared page would represent a waste of materials that the community cannot afford. The smell of damp wool habits drying near the Calefactorium moves through the lower room and ascends the stair to where the copyists work. The habits, washed at intervals that the rule specifies, have been hung to dry in the warmth of the fire, and the moisture that departs from the wool carries with it the particular scent of wet animal fiber, a smell that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply present, a component of the environment that the monks inhabit without remarking upon it. This scent mingles with the sharper odor of the oak gall ink, with the faint sweetness of the parchment itself, with the cold air that enters through the unglazed windows of the upper room. The abbot walks the cloister, observing without speaking as the rule commands. His presence is felt before it is seen. A movement in the peripheral vision of the monks who pass through the covered walks on their errands between the ranges. He does not speak, for the rule enjoins upon him a particular reserve, a silence of authority that allows him to perceive without intervening, to understand without directing. The abbot wears the same garments as the others, distinguished only by the stole that he assumes for liturgical functions and the staff that he carries as the sign of his office. You are working at your desk, and the abbot passes below the window of the Scriptorium, and his footsteps upon the paving of the cloister are audible, and then they move beyond the range of your hearing, and the work continues. The cellarer moves through the storerooms that lie beneath the west range of the cloister. He checks stores, barley for the brewery, dried beans, salted fish from the Rhine, and his inspection is methodical, his records maintained with the precision that the management of a great household requires. The barley occupies a substantial portion of the store, for beer was the standard drink of the community, the water of the well being reserved for washing and for the preparation of medicines. The cellarer's voice moves through the storerooms as he instructs the lay servants who assist him, for his office permits him a speech that the monks in chapter have renounced, the practical necessities of administration requiring a communication that the rule accommodates. The salted fish from the Rhine lies in barrels that the cellarer opens in turn, the salt that preserves the flesh having drawn the moisture from the meat in the months since the autumn catch. The smell of the fish, sharp and particular, moves through the storeroom and mingles with the earthier scent of the dried beans that are stored in sacks upon the shelves. The cellarer counts, and he records, and he determines what must be ordered, what must be conserved, what must be distributed to the kitchen for the preparation of the day's meals. The principal meal will require the resources that the cellarer now verifies, the refectory reading that accompanies it still distant in the hours ahead. The warming room below the Scriptorium holds a fire that has been fed with the beech wood that the abbey's forests provide. The Calefactorium was permitted only in winter, typically from November to Easter, and the months of its permission are drawing toward their close, for Easter approaches with the spring that remains invisible in the frozen world outside. The novice who carried the ink works now at the fire, mixing the crushed oak galls with the copperas and the gum that will bind the pigment to the parchment. The heat of the fire moves across his face, and the cold of the room recedes from his back, and the contrast between these temperatures is one of the sensations that the winter months produce, a bodily awareness of the season that the monks carry without complaint. The copyists who now work upon lesser texts are heirs to the tradition that produced the Codex Aureus. That work, with its purple pages and its gold lettering, its illuminations that consume the labor of months, represents the summit of what the Scriptorium can achieve, and the daily work of copying texts of theology or medicine or the rule itself continues this tradition in its more modest register. You are writing now, and the reed pen moves across the ruled page, and the ink flows from the slit that you have cut with your penknife, and the letters form in the Caroline minuscule that the Scriptorium has perfected. The sound of parchment being ruled with lead point continues at the farther end of the Scriptorium, where a copyist has begun a new choir and must prepare its pages before the writing can commence. The sound is intermittent, for the ruling requires attention to the measurement of the lines, and the copyist pauses between each passage to verify the regularity of his work. The particular silence of many men working in proximity without speech persists, broken only by these slight sounds of labor, by the occasional movement of a monk shifting his position upon the bench, by the distant noise of the cloister world below where the lay servants perform their tasks without the constraint of monastic silence. The light through the round-arched windows has strengthened now, though it remains the pale light of winter, a luminosity without warmth that reveals the world in its bare structure without the enrichment of color. The stone of the window embrasures continues to hold this light, to glow with that faint luminosity that the dawn produces, while the sky visible through the openings remains a pale grey that suggests the possibility of cloud, of snow, of the weather that the season may yet deliver. You are working at your desk, and the light falls upon your page, and the ink dries upon the parchment in the cold air of the Scriptorium, and the morning continues in its slow progression toward the hour when the bell will summon the community to the next office. The abbot has completed his circuit of the cloister, and he has returned to his private quarters in the South Range, where the business of the house will require his attention until the hour of the next office. He has removed the scapula that he assumed for his walk, resuming the simpler habit of his private hours. The memory of the chapter meeting persists in the minds of the monks as they work, the assignments of the day directing their attention, the discipline of the rule governing their movements and their silence. The cellarer has completed his inspection of the stores, and his record of their state has been entered in the ledger that he maintains. The barley for the brewery will be conveyed to the brew house, where the process of fermentation will transform the grain into the beer that the monks consume at their meals. The water that the brewery uses has been drawn by the lay servants who perform this labor. Their movements around the well are constant presence in the cloister during the working hours. The quantity that the community requires is substantial, the daily consumption of each monk being regulated neither by scarcity nor by excess, but by the custom of the house. The murmur of mass celebrations continues in the church below the Scriptorium. The priests have assistants among the monks who are not themselves ordained, and the cycle of the daily mass moves through the morning in its several iterations, each priest fulfilling the obligation that his ordination has laid upon him. The sound of the Latin, familiar from the offices of the night and the dawn, moves through the stone walls in vibrations that the copyists perceive without attending to, a component of the acoustic environment that they inhabit as they work. The novice who prepared the inks has completed his task, and he has returned to the novitiate in the West Range, where the master of novices will instruct him in the texts that he must learn. You are working at your desk, and the pen moves across the page, and the text that you copy is a treatise on the calculation of the date of Easter, that movable feast upon which the entire liturgical year depends. The computation requires attention to the cycles of the moon and the sun, to the 19-year pattern that reconciles their movements, and the text that you copy explains these matters with the clarity that the learned monks of Lorsch have cultivated. The Monastery of Fulda was founded in 744. By you are seated at a long oak table in the north range of the monastery at Corvey, where the light falls evenly through windows that face neither the rising nor the setting sun. The stone walls around you hold the coolness of night even as the morning advances, and the gradual warming of the space comes so slowly that you mark it only by the softening of the air against your wrists. The table before you is worn smooth by generations of scribes who have worked in this same position, their shoulders bent, their eyes lowered to the parchment that lies flat beneath their hands. Around you, others have already begun their labor, and the scratch of quill on vellum, varying pitch with the angle of writing, creates a texture of sound that fills the long room without ever rising to the level of speech. The Scriptorium at Corvey held one of the most valuable libraries in the region, a collection gathered across decades of deliberate acquisition and careful preservation. You have seen some of these volumes yourself, for the Armarius controls access to books and assigns copying tasks, and you were granted permission only after months of proving your skill with simpler texts. The books you copy now come from chests stored in the upper room, volumes of classical authors including Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid, their pages handled with the reverence due to objects of such rarity. Books were stored in chests or cupboards, not on open shelves, for protection, and the Armarius keeps the keys at his belt, unlocking them only when a new copying task is approved by the abbot. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment, distinct from poorly cured skin, rises from the sheet before you as you smooth it with your palm. This skin came from a sheep slaughtered in autumn, and you know something of the labor that brought it to this state, for parchment was prepared from sheepskin, requiring up to 12 stages from flaying to finishing. The flesh was scraped clean, the hair loosened in lime baths, the skin stretched on a frame and scraped again and again until it grew thin enough to receive ink without bleeding. The dry dust of pounce, cuttlefish bone powder, used to prepare greasy parchment, still lingers in the pores of this sheet, and you feel its slight roughness beneath your fingertips as you test the surface for any remaining oil that might resist your pen. A scribe sharpens his quill at the far end of your table, testing the nib against his thumbnail with a motion so practiced it requires no attention from his eyes. The sound of his blade against the shaft comes to you in brief intervals, a soft scratching distinct from the writing sounds that surround it. You have performed this same task yourself 1,000 times, selecting the feather for its strength, stripping the barbs, shaping the point to hold ink, and release it in measured flow. The stiffness of fingers gripping a quill for hours without pause is a condition you have learned to accept, though you flex your own hand now, before the work begins, rotating the wrist to delay the ache that will come. Corvey was founded in 822 with approval from Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, and the library you serve has grown through the patronage of his successors and the labor of monks who came before you. The westwork at Corvey, begun in 873, contains the oldest surviving monumental wall paintings in northern Europe, though you have not seen them yourself, for your days pass in this north range with its even, cool light and its silence broken only by the tools of your trade. The Monastery of Lorsch, where the Lorscher Arsnebuch was composed, lies many days to the south, and the script at Lorsch was Carolingian minuscule, developed for clarity and uniformity, the same script that you have been taught to form with deliberate regularity. You take up your awl and prick the parchment with small holes along the left margin, spacing them by the width of your hand. He pricks the parchment with an awl and rules lines with lead point held against a ruler, and you follow this pattern now, drawing your lead point across the surface to connect the holes in faint grey lines that will guide your letters and disappear into the text once the page is complete. The ruler is of beechwood, darkened by the oils of countless hands, and you hold it steady with your left forefinger while the lead moves beneath it. The lines emerge slowly, parallel, and even establishing the discipline within which your writing must remain. The Armarius checks progress on a copy of Bede's ecclesiastical history, begun in autumn, and you feel his presence at your shoulder before you hear his footsteps, the slight shadow that crosses your page, warning you to pause. He does not speak, for speech is forbidden in the Scriptorium, except when instruction requires it, but his finger traces the line you have just completed, testing the consistency of your ink and the height of your letters against the exemplar he holds in his other hand. The sharp metallic scent of oak gall ink rises as he disturbs the still wet surface of your last word, and you wait with held breath for his judgment. Ink was made from oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic, and you prepared your own supply only last week, crushing the galls in rainwater, adding the green vitriol and the binding agent in proportions learned by repetition. He moves on without comment, which is itself the approval you sought, and you resume your work with the next line of text. The visual rhythm of brown text, red rubrics, and blue initials on the page will emerge only gradually, for you write now in the plain black ink, leaving spaces where the rubricator will later add the red headings and the painter the decorated letters. Red ink from minium, lead oxide, requires a different preparation, a different pen, a different hand, and you have not yet been trusted with that responsibility. The words you form are of Bede's Latin, clear and measured, describing the conversion of the English peoples to the faith that sustains you now in this monastery on the Weser. The morning advances further, and the gradual warming of the North Range has softened the air enough that you no longer feel the chill of stone through your woolen sleeve. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment has become so familiar that you notice it only when a new sheet is laid before you. The difference between one skin and another subtle, but perceptible to senses trained by repetition. A younger monk struggles with an unfamiliar Greek loan word in a medical recipe at the table across from yours, and you see his hesitation in the stillness of his hand, the quill held above the page, while his lips move silently around syllables that hold no meaning for him. The Lorcher Arsnebuch was written in Latin under Benedictine supervision, not in the vernacular, but its sources included texts that came through Greek and Arabic transmission, and the medical vocabulary retains words that belong to no language the younger monk has studied. You watch him reach for his wax tablet, where he has written the word in approximation, and his brow remains furrowed as he compares it against the exemplar, seeking the shape that will make it legible even if he cannot pronounce it with confidence. Perhaps this young man was given this text before he was ready, or perhaps the difficulty itself is the lesson he is meant to learn. The scratch of quill on vellum continues around you as you return to your own page, forming the letters that describe Bede's account of the monastery at Lindisfarne, the community that produced the gospel book you have heard described, but never seen. The script you write now descends from that same Carolingian reform, the rounded letters connected by ligatures that speed the hand without sacrificing readability. A skilled scribe produced approximately 6 to 8 pages of text per day, and you know your own capacity, the point at which fatigue thickens your strokes and tightens your spacing, the moment when continuation would produce errors that must be corrected with the knife. The sharp metallic scent of oak gall ink mingles now with the faint sweetness of the gum arabic that binds it, and you dip your pen with a motion that has become unconscious, touching the nib to the lip of your inkhorn to shed the excess that would blot. The dry dust of Pounce still rises faintly when you shift your sheet, though you powdered it yourself this morning, and the excess has long since settled. The production of a complete Bible required approximately 15 months of continuous labor, and though your current task is less ambitious, the principle remains the same. The steady accumulation of perfect pages, each one dependent on the discipline of the day before and the day to follow. You have completed 4 pages since Prime, and this pace, maintained, will satisfy the schedule that the Armarius established when autumn turned to winter and the work was assigned. The volume you produce will enter the chests in the upper room when the binding is complete, the pages sewn and glued and covered in skin that matches the parchment within. A copy of the rule itself was kept in the refectory for reading aloud during meals, and you have heard it read while you ate in silence, the words of Benedict governing even the moments when your hands were not occupied with labor. The midday bell for Sext interrupts work, and the sound penetrates the north range through openings you cannot see from where you sit. Quills are laid in leather rolls across the room, the movement simultaneous, though no signal passed between the monks who perform it, the habit of obedience expressed in the coordinated stilling of hands. You lay down your own pen, rolling it in the strip of leather that protects the nib, and flex your fingers against the stiffness that has accumulated. The ache is deeper now, a warmth that borders on pain, and you press the palm of your left hand against the right, warming the joints that have grown cold with concentration. The Scriptorium was typically located in the north range for even, cool light, and you feel the truth of this choice as you stand from your bench. For the sun that has warmed other parts of the monastery has not disturbed this room, and the air remains temperate against your face. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment follows you as you move toward the door, clinging to your sleeves and your hands, a reminder of the labor that will resume when the office is complete. You walk with the others toward the church, your steps measured, your eyes lowered, the silence of the Scriptorium extending into the corridor and the cloister beyond. The scratch of quill on vellum still resonates in your inner ear, a phantom persistence that will fade only when the chant of Sext replaces it with other sounds. The church receives you with its greater darkness, the candles at the altar visible from the nave where you take your place. The responses come automatically, the Latin syllables shaped by years of repetition, and your voice merges with the others in the pattern that Benedict prescribed. Yet some part of your attention remains with the page you left unfinished, the sentence that awaits its completion, the letter forms that your hand will resume when the office ends. The sharp metallic scent of oak gall ink seems to cling to your fingers even here, or perhaps it is memory that preserves it, the sensory imprint of labor too concentrated to release its hold entirely. The service concludes, and you return to the north range with the others, the gradual warming of the morning now giving way to a different quality of light, the afternoon brightness that comes from the west, though your windows face north. The dry dust of Pounce has settled further in your absence, and you brush your sheet lightly before resuming, clearing any particle that might resist the ink and create a flaw. An older monk demonstrates the proper angle of pen to parchment for consistent letter forms to the younger man who struggled with the Greek loanword, and you observe this instruction without turning your head, the movement visible at the edge of your vision. The older monk's hand moves slowly, forming a letter that the younger man copies on his wax tablet, the angle of 45 degrees maintained with a steadiness that comes only from decades of practice. The angle of the pen to the horizontal determines the weight of the strokes, the contrast between thick downstrokes and thin horizontals that gives Carolingian minuscule its visual harmony. You have learned this angle yourself, though you adjust it slightly for the particular cut of your nib, the particular resistance of the parchment you face today. You resume your page, finding the rhythm that Sext interrupted, the flow of Bede's narrative carrying you forward through the history of the English Church, the conversions and the controversies, the calculations of Easter that you copied in the previous chapter and that now continue in the text before you. You were given this text because your hand has proven capable of the sustained attention it requires, the capacity to maintain consistency across hundreds of pages. The afternoon moves slowly, measured by the accumulation of text rather than by any external change in the light that enters your windows. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment has become the atmosphere you breathe, the medium in which your consciousness moves, and you notice it only when a brother at the next table receives a new sheet from the pile and the fresh skin releases its stored scent. The scratch of quill on vellum surrounds you in its continuous texture, each scribe's particular rhythm contributing to a whole that never resolves into melody, but persists as a kind of sustained drone, the auditory equivalent of the light that does not change. Error correction involved scraping with a knife, and you have performed this correction twice today. Small errors caught immediately and removed with the blade you keep at your right hand, the scraped patch receiving fresh ink when the surface is smooth again. Major errors could require restarting the quire, the gathering of 4 sheets that must be discarded if the error penetrates too deeply, and the fear of this consequence sharpens your attention when fatigue begins to blur your focus. The sharp metallic scent of oak gall ink rises from your page as you complete another line, the words describing Bede's death at Jarrow, the translation of his relics, the reverence in which his writings were held. The ecclesiastical history you copy will join the collection at Corvey when your hand is finished with it, the exemplar returned to its chest, your copy taking its place among the volumes that preserve learning for the monks who will come after you. The dry dust of Pounce has worked its way into the grain of the table before you, a pale residue that marks the place where generations of scribes have performed this same labor. The completed quires are pressed between wooden boards with weights to flatten, and you have seen the press in the room below, the stacks of finished gatherings compressed until the sheets lose their curl and lie flat for the binder's needle. Your own pages will join this press when the current quire is complete, the 8 sheets folded and arranged in the proper order, the thread that will bind them still waiting in the hands of the brother who specializes in this final stage. He counts your pages, compares the total against his record, and his slight nod indicates that your labor has satisfied the measure expected of this day. The gradual warming of the morning has reversed now into a gradual cooling, the stone walls releasing their stored warmth into the evening air, and you feel this change as a settling, a preparation for the night that will follow. You complete the line you have begun, the final word of the page forming beneath your hand with the same care as the first, the discipline of the Scriptorium requiring that fatigue never excuse diminishment. Your completed pages will rest in such security tonight, locked away by the Armarius, who controls access to books and assigns copying tasks with the same attention he brings to every aspect of this monastery's preservation of texts. The bell for Vespers releases you from your bench, and you lay down your quill with the others, the leather rolls accumulating along the tables, the inkhorns stoppered, the exemplars gathered by the Armarius for safekeeping. The scratch of quill on vellum ceases gradually, not all at once, as each scribe completes his final stroke and cleans his nib with a scrap of wool. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment remains in the room when you have left it, the atmosphere of labor persisting in the empty space, waiting for the morning when you will return. You walk toward the church again, your steps slower now, your hand empty at your side, the fingers still shaped to the pen they have released. The sharp metallic scent of oak gall ink has faded from your awareness, replaced by the cold air of the cloister, the distant sound of the river beyond the walls, the silence that settles over the monastery as darkness comes. The responses of Vespers rise around you, and your voice joins them, the Latin words shaped by a throat that has been silent since Sext, the interval of copying having absorbed all the speech that the rule permits. The script at Lorsch was Carolingian minuscule, developed for clarity and uniformity, and the script you write maintains this clarity across the distance that separates you from the hands that first devised it, the uniformity that binds you to a tradition you did not choose but have accepted. The office ends, and you move with the others toward the refectory, where a copy of the rule itself was kept for reading aloud during meals. Though the evening meal requires no such reading, the silence broken only by the necessary sounds of eating. You take your place on the bench, the bread and the pulse before you, and your hands move automatically, the right hand that held the quill now holding the spoon, the transition requiring no thought. The meal concludes, and you walk toward the dormitory, your steps measured by fatigue, your eyes lowered to the stones that pass beneath your feet. The dry dust of Pounce has left a faint whiteness on your sleeve where you brushed against the table, and you notice this only now, in the candlelight of the corridor, a trace of the day's labor that will wash away when you perform your ablutions. The gradual warming of the North Range as morning advances seems distant now, a memory of the morning that has passed into the evening, the cycle that will repeat when you wake and return to your bench. You lie on your pallet in the darkness of the dormitory, the breathing of the brothers around you creating a texture of sound not unlike the scratch of quill on vellum. Though this comparison comes to you only in the drift towards sleep, the mind releasing its hold on the literal. The faint animal smell of well-prepared parchment has followed you here, or perhaps it is the smell of your own hands, the skin having absorbed the atmosphere of the Scriptorium beyond the power of washing to remove. The Armarius controls access to books and assigns copying tasks, and in your half-sleep you see his face, the unlined severity of his expression as he evaluates your work, the slight nod that constitutes his highest praise. The gradual cooling of the dormitory as night deepens draws you further down, the rhythm of your breathing slowing to match the others, the collective descent into rest that prepares the body for the labor of the day to come. The scratch of quill on vellum, varying pitch with the angle of writing, still sounds somewhere in the depths of your mind, a persistence that will carry you through the darkness until the bell for Matins calls you back to prayer, and after prayer to the North Range, to the table worn smooth by generations, to the parchment and the ink and the silence that is not silence, but the texture of work performed without speech, the devotion of the hand that serves the word. The bell for Terce calls monks from the Scriptorium to the church for 15 minutes. You are standing in the corridor when the first strike reaches you, the bronze vibration hanging in the frozen air at Corvée. The Armarius has already closed his ledger, and the brothers around you are setting down their quills with the careful deliberation of men who do not hurry. Somewhere in the distant yard, merchants are unloading their cargoes, but that commerce belongs to another world, and you turn toward the church with the others, your hands still bearing the faint stain of oak gall ink. The cold air moves across your face as you step outside, and the sound of wooden clogs on frozen ground between buildings accompanies the procession. The Benedictine rule specifies manual labor as essential to the monastic vocation, and already your body anticipates the transition from the stillness of copying to the movement of work. The church at Corvée receives you in its accustomed darkness, the winter windows admitting only a grey diffusion that barely distinguishes the arcade from the vault. You are standing among the brothers when the psalm begins, the voices layered in the space that Charlemagne's masons raised in Saxon territory. The agricultural estates of Lorsch are recorded in the Lorscher Codex from the 9th century, and you think of that distant house, its monks perhaps also singing at this hour, their voices similarly suspended in stone. The sun has not reached its height, and the morning remains in that long period between dawn and the middle of the day. The prior's voice joins the chant from his stall, and you observe without turning the brothers who have arrived from the brewery, their hands still smelling of malt or earth or ink. The steam rising from open mash tuns in the brewhouse has touched their wool, and you recognize the sweetness of conversion, the grain becoming something else. After Terce, some brothers proceed to the brewery where malt is being stirred. You follow at a distance, your own assignment having been given by the cellarer at chapter yesterday, and you observe the operation as you pass. The abbey brewery produced beer for daily consumption, water being unsafe to drink, and the men at the tuns move in the rhythm of a task that will continue through Sext and beyond. The smell of yeast and fermentation in the brewery, distinct from bread yeast, reaches you where you stand at the threshold, and you note the difference, the particular wildness of beer yeast that speaks of open vessels and airborne inoculation. Corvey developed as an economic centre in the 9th and 10th centuries in Saxon territory, and this production is part of that accumulation, the transformation of barley into sustenance, of labour into stability. The warming room was closed from Easter to November according to most customaries, and so these men work in the cold, their breath joining the steam in visible clouds. Others enter the walled herb garden to tend plants specified in the medical handbook. You are standing at the garden gate when the brittle texture of frozen herb stems in the winter garden greets your reaching hand, the rosemary having stiffened into something that resembles wood more than leaf. The monastery garden provided vegetables and medicinal plants documented in the Lorscher Arsnebuch, and the brother in charge of this enclosure moves along the rows with the knowledge of that text in his memory, his fingers testing what the frost has done to each species. The cold ache of fingers after digging in half-frozen soil is a sensation you will know later this morning. But for now you only watch, your own hands still clean from the church. The Rhine Valley convents, including those near Bingen, participated in similar economic networks, and you imagine their gardens similarly constrained by the season, their infirmarians similarly consulting ancient authorities for the properties of what survives. A group departs for the outlying fields to check winter wheat under snow. You are walking with them as far as the gate, the sound of wooden clogs on frozen ground between buildings giving way to the deeper silence of the road beyond the walls. The Grange at Lorsch managed scattered properties across the Middle Rhine, and you think of that distance, the administration required to maintain coherence across such separation. The monks worked in the fields during harvest under the direction of the cellarer or granger, but harvest is months away, and now the task is only observation, the confirmation that what was sown still lives beneath its white covering. The sheep were kept for wool and parchment. The abbey maintained flocks on its outlying estates, and you pass the fold where they huddle against the wind, their own breath visible in the cold air. The distant ring of the smith's hammer from the workshop across the enclosure reaches you even here, the Fabris continuing its manufacture regardless of who walks abroad. The cellarer inspects the fish pond, ice-covered, where carp wait for spring harvest. You have turned back toward the enclosure when you encounter him at the pond's edge, his figure dark against the grey ice that has sealed the water. The River Weser at Corvey provided fish and facilitated trade and transport, and this pond is an extension of that abundance, a storage of protein against the season of fasting and the season of need. The ice is thick enough to bear a man's weight, but the cellarer does not test it, content to observe from the margin, his breath rising in the same rhythm as the vapour that escapes at the pond's one open point, the spring or the inlet that prevents complete freezing. The standard ration was 1 pound of bread per monk per day, and the fish will supplement this when the calendar permits, the protein of the river joining the carbohydrate of the grain in the measured sustenance of the community. You are standing in the workshop yard when the distant ring of the smith's hammer becomes immediate, the sound now connected to the visible sparks that fly from his anvil. The workshop produced and repaired tools, liturgical vessels, and building materials, and the man at work shapes what will be needed for the coming season of construction, the repairs that frost has made necessary in roofs and drains. The particular quality of noon light in the cloister, directly overhead, has not yet arrived, but the sun has risen sufficiently to strike the smith's face as he works, the sweat on his skin steaming in the cold air. The bread was baked in communal ovens, and you think of the oven's heat, the contrast it offers to this outdoor cold, the transformation of dough that parallels the transformation of ore. The morning continues in its divisions, and you are moving through them without the urgency that the world beyond the walls would impose. The smell of yeast and fermentation has settled into the building's fabric, and a brother emerging to relieve himself carries it on his clothing, the scent of his vocation. You are standing at the junction of paths when the brittle texture of frozen herb stems reminds you of your own assignment, and you turn toward the Infirmarian's plot. The sound of wooden clogs on frozen ground between buildings signals the movement of the community through its appointed stations, and you hear, without looking, the brothers who pass behind you, their conversation limited to what the task requires. The cold air moves across your face as you straighten from your digging, and you observe the enclosure from this vantage, the buildings arranged in their medieval logic. You are standing at the brewery door when the bell for Sext begins, the note reaching you through the air that carries also the steam and the smell of conversion. At Sext, the community reassembles, hands still smelling of malt or earth or ink, and you join the movement toward the church, your own hands bearing the soil of the garden, the cold ache persisting as you walk. The prior notes who is absent without leave. Discipline is maintained without drama, and you observe as you enter the church the empty stall, the slight adjustment in the prior's posture as he registers the absence and files it for later attention. The psalm for Sext speaks of labor and its cessation, of the sun's course and the providence that governs it, and you are standing among the brothers when the words reach their conclusion. The bread was baked in communal ovens, and you anticipate the bread that will follow this office, the simple meal that constitutes the monastic dinner, the protein and carbohydrate measured against the requirements of the body engaged in manual labor. The prior's voice completes the final prayer, and the community disperses with the same deliberation that brought it together, the movement from collective to individual without haste or display. The distant ring of the smith's hammer has paused, the smith also attending to his sustenance, the anvil cooling in his absence. You are walking toward the refectory when the sound of wooden clogs on frozen ground between buildings accompanies you, the brothers from the brewery joining the stream, their hands still smelling of malt or earth or ink, the steam rising from open mash tuns having given way to the steam of their own bodies in the cold air between buildings. The refectory receives you in its accustomed arrangement, the tables set with what the morning's labor has prepared. The meal concludes in silence, the reading continuing until the last man has finished, and you are standing in the cloister when the community disperses to its afternoon occupations. You are standing at the brewery window when the afternoon resumes, observing the process that continues without your participation. The smell of yeast and fermentation has intensified as the temperature in the tuns rises through the day's progression, the biological activity generating its own heat, the transformation accelerating. The cold air moves across your face as you leave the brewery, and you walk toward the garden where your morning work remains to be completed. The brittle texture of frozen herb stems has softened slightly in the afternoon sun, the temperature having risen to the point where ice becomes water, where the plant resumes some faint metabolism. You are standing upright when the distant ring of the smith's hammer from the workshop across the enclosure resumes, the smith having completed his meal and returned to his anvil. The afternoon progresses in its measured way, and you are standing in the garden when the light begins its noticeable decline, the sun moving toward the horizon that will bring Vespers and the evening's collation. The Benedictine rule specifies manual labor as important to the monastic vocation, and absence from this labor was considered alongside absence from the office, with both obligations seen as contributing to the coherence of individual life in relation to the community. The monastery garden likely provided vegetables and medicinal plants similar to those documented in the Lorcher Arsnebuch. though the anonymous labor of the monastic day, the contribution without signature, would have left no individual record of such work. The Rhine Valley convents, including those near Bingen, likely participated in similar economic networks, and daily life in those houses probably proceeded in similar rhythm, as the shared rule would have produced shared time across the distance of the valley and the river. The cold air moves across your face as you walk, and you pass the brewery where the Abbey Brewery produced beer for daily consumption, water being unsafe to drink, the men there still attending to their vessels, the process requiring the day's full attention. The steam rising from open mash tuns has ceased entirely now, the heat contained, the transformation proceeding in darkness and enclosure. The smell of yeast and fermentation reaches you as you pass, the identity of the house marked by this scent, the particularity of its production against the generic requirements of sustenance. You are standing in the cloister when the light has declined to the point where the arcade becomes necessary as shelter, the outdoor circulation of noon no longer comfortable. You are standing at the church door when the bell for none begins, the note that calls the community from its dispersed labor to the collective acknowledgement of the passing day. The psalm for none speaks of the evening and its approach, of the labor that ceases and the rest that is promised, and you are standing among the brothers when the words reach their conclusion. You are standing at the brewery door when the day's production is assessed, the cellarer observing the level in the vessels, the specific gravity of what has been achieved, the record that will be made in the account of the house, earning to equilibrium after its exertion. The morning has moved through its offices, and the sun now stands at the meridian, the hour of Sext having been sung in the chapter house with the psalms of the 6th hour. You are standing in the cloister garth as the community forms its procession, the brothers emerging from their stalls in the church in the order of their seniority, the oldest first, the youngest last, the whole line moving with the unhurried pace of men who have performed this action thousands of times across thousands of days. The refectory at Lorsch was located in the range adjacent to the kitchen, and you follow the line as it turns beneath the arcade, the smell of wood smoke and cooking herbs preceding the actual sight of the long hall. The door stands open, and the brothers enter without speaking, each finding his place at the long tables with benches, standing now in silence as the last of the line files in. The stone floor, bare walls, and long tables with benches compose the whole architecture of the room, nothing hung for ornament, nothing softened for comfort, the space designed for a single purpose that has drawn these men from their labor in the fields and the scriptorium and the workshops of the abbey. You take your place among them, feeling the hardness of the bench beneath you, the slight give of the wood, the coolness of the stone transmitted through the soles of your shoes. The main meal was taken after Sext, around the 6th hour, and lasted approximately 1 hour, this duration being measured not by any device, but by the progress of the reading, the consumption of the food, the gradual satisfaction of hunger that moves through a body at its own pace. A novice carries the lectern book, placing it precisely on the angled reading desk, the heavy volume requiring both his arms, his fingers careful on the binding, the pages that have been turned so many times they have softened at the edges like cloth worn thin by handling. The reader's place was elevated and separated, a platform at the end of the hall from which the single voice could carry to every corner, the acoustics of the stone-vaulted hall shaped by centuries of this practice, this voice, this listening. The reader changed weekly, and preparation required memorization or discreet prompting, for the rule forbids speaking during meals, and even the reader must not interrupt his text with consultation or question. You watch as the appointed brother ascends to his platform, the wooden lectern creaking as he shifts his weight, settling himself before the open pages, his own meal having been taken before the community assembled or deferred, until after the Thanksgiving prayer. The reader begins from the life of Saint Benedict as the first bread is broken. The Latin opening with the familiar cadence of a story these men have heard so often, it has become part of the texture of their consciousness. No longer merely narrative, but atmosphere, the medium through which they move as fish move through water. The resonance of a single voice reading Latin in a stone-vaulted hall fills the space above the heads of the eating men, the sound finding the vault and returning, enriched by the stone, carrying to the farthest bench without effort, without strain. The particular quality of swallowed sound in a room full of eating men who do not speak creates an acoustic unlike any other, the small noises of consumption present but subdued, as if even the act of eating understood the discipline of the place, the requirement of silence. You hear the sound of wooden spoons on earthenware bowls, rhythmic and unhurried, each man setting his own tempo, no haste, no competition, the spoons finding the same pace as the reader's voice, all movements synchronized to a common measure. The celera serves from common dishes, portions equal, distributed without favor, the rule's instruction on this point being absolute, no distinction made for rank or origin or the nature of a man's work. The standard diet consisted of bread, vegetables, legumes, fish, and beer, this being the fare that sustains the body without exciting it, that provides energy without inflaming desire. The visual pattern of brown bread, green herbs, and white fish on dark wood repeats itself along the length of the table, each place set with the same arrangement, the same quantities, the same simple sufficiency. Meat was generally prohibited, except for the sick in the infirmary, the Lorcher Arsnebuch, including dietary advice and recipes for convalescence, those special preparations that restore the weakened body while the main community continues in its abstention. You observe the draught from high windows carrying the smell of the kitchen smoke, the air moving through the hall in a slow circulation that carries away the steam of the food and brings in the cooler atmosphere of the cloister outside. The smell of pea pottage with herbs, no meat, steaming in wooden trenches rises from each place, the herbs being those that grow in the physic garden, the ones that strengthen digestion and purify the blood, their green fragrance distinct above the more substantial notes of the legumes and the fish. Corvey's position on the Weser allowed access to herring and other preserved fish, and you know that similar provisions reach this table, the salt herring that keeps through winter, the stockfish softened by soaking, the river fish when the season permits, and the monks who manage the fishery send their barrels. The Lorcher Codex records substantial agricultural tithes in kind to support the community, the grain that becomes the bread, the peas that become the pottage, the hops that become the beer, all flowing into the abbey's storehouses from the surrounding estates, the obligation of the countryside to maintain these men in their prayer and their labor. Leftover bread was collected for the almoner to distribute to the poor at the gate, nothing wasted, nothing kept beyond the need of the day, the surplus passing outward to those whose hunger is not met by the regular provision of any house. A monk signals by sign that he requires salt, another passes it without eye contact, the communication accomplished in the economy of gesture that the rule permits, the hands moving in the space above the table, the small dish transferred, the needs satisfied without the violation of a single spoken word. You watch the exchange, the delicacy of it, the way the passing brother does not pause in his eating, the receiving brother does not interrupt his attention to the reader's voice, the whole transaction subordinate to the greater discipline of the hour. The reader continues, his voice holding the same measure, the life of St. Benedict proceeding through its chapters, the saint's own establishment of this practice being itself the subject of the text, the circularity of it, the performance enacting what it describes. The reader stumbles on a Latin ablative absolute, his voice hesitating, the construction unfamiliar, or his memory failing at that particular phrase. No one reacts or corrects, the silence of the room absorbing the stumble as it absorbs all other sound, the reader recovering himself, finding the construction, proceeding with no acknowledgement of the lapse. The wooden lectern creaks as he shifts his weight, resetting his position, his finger finding the line again, the Latin resuming its flow. You feel the quality of this non-reaction, the charity in it, the way the community protects the reader from embarrassment, the way the silence itself becomes a form of support, a holding of the space in which he may find his way back to the text. Fasting days reduce the meal to one, taken in the evening after Vespers, the whole structure of the day altered, the morning offices moving through emptiness, the body learning to work without the expectation of satisfaction. The Lenten fast excluded all animal products except fish, the diet narrowing further, the discipline intensifying, the 40 days moving toward the celebration of the resurrection with a gradual stripping away of all that is not essential. You are not in that season now, but the memory of it informs this ordinary meal, the contrast between the sufficiency of this table and the austerity of that one giving meaning to both, each understood through the other. The sound of wooden spoons on earthenware bowls continues, the rhythm unchanged, the reader's voice weaving through it, the two sounds not competing but coexisting, each occupying its own register. You feel this presence in your own body, the way the sound enters through the ears and seems to settle somewhere in the chest, the vibrations of it felt as much as heard, the Latin meaning something even to those whose understanding of the grammar is imperfect, the cadence carrying significance beyond the literal sense. The draught from high windows continues its slow movement, the air in the hall turning over, the smoke smell diminishing as the kitchen itself moves to other tasks, the afternoon's requirements. You notice how the silence is not empty but full, occupied by the reader's voice, the small sounds of eating, the breathing of 50 men, the movement of air, the settling of the building itself as the sun warms the stone of the roof and the walls expand in their minute fashion. The creak of the reader's wooden lectern marks a transition, perhaps a chapter ending, the page being turned, the new section beginning with a slight change in the pitch of his voice, a fresh energy entering even as his body signals its own fatigue, the standing, the speaking, the concentration of the hour. The cellera moves along the far side of the hall, observing, not serving now, but watching that all proceeds according to the rule, that no conversation threatens to break out, that the portions have been sufficient, that the beer has reached every place. The beer is in earthenware jugs, poured with the same equality as the food, the liquid dark in the cup, its own nourishment, its own contribution to the sustenance of the day. You taste it, the bitterness of the hops, the grain's sweetness beneath, the knowledge that this too comes from the abbey's own production, the brewery with its measured vessels, its account of the house, its careful calculation of need against supply. The reader continues, his voice now in a passage of exhortation, the saint speaking to his own followers about the nature of the common life, the renunciation of private will, the practice of obedience. The reader's place was elevated and separated so that he might be seen as well as heard, the visual focus of the room, the one moving figure in a field of stillness, his hand occasionally rising to gesture, falling again, the text itself guiding his movements. You watch him, the distance making him small, the elevation restoring his significance, the whole composition of the hall directing attention toward that single point, that single voice, that single interpretation of the text they all hold in common. The wooden lectern creaks as he shifts his weight again, the hour moving toward its close, the reading approaching the passage that will end with the thanksgiving, the signal for the community to rise. The sound of wooden spoons on earthenware bowls has become sporadic, some men finished, others lingering over the last of their pottage. the rhythm dissolving as the collective act resolves into individual completion. The reader's voice takes on a quality of valediction, the words themselves preparing for ending, the cadence rising toward the final clause, the pause that will follow. You feel the hour now complete, the satisfaction of the body matching the satisfaction of the ear, the whole self fed by this double provision. The reader speaks the closing words, the prayer of thanksgiving following, the community rising from their benches in the same order they entered, seniority determining all movement in this place. The meal concludes with the prayer of thanksgiving. Scraps are gathered for the poor. The almoner's function beginning even as the brothers file out, returning to their labor, their rest, the continuation of the day's offices. You remain a moment, watching the novice collect the lectern book, the heavy volume requiring the same care in removal as in placement, his arms forming the same angle, his step the same measured pace. The kitchen's activity continues beyond the door, the preparation for the evening, the morrow, the endless cycle of feeding this community and the others who depend upon it. The swallowed sound lingers after the men have gone, the acoustic memory, the sense that the silence itself has been shaped by what it contained, the voice, the spoons, the breathing, the creak of wood. The draught from high windows continues, the air now carrying only the kitchen's distant smoke, the smell of the next preparation, the future meal. You move toward the door, the afternoon light entering from the cloister, the warmth of the sun on the stone threshold, the world beyond this hall continuing in its ordinary magnificence, the day moving toward evening, toward Vespers, toward the night and its own offices. This reader's week is not complete. He will ascend again tomorrow. The same platform, the same lectern, the same requirement of memorization or discreet prompting. The rule will be kept again, the sign language where necessary, the passing of salt without eye contact, the whole fabric of the practice maintained by repetition, by the willingness of each man to enter again into what he has entered before. You see the basket now, the fragments gathered, the almoner himself perhaps already moving toward his duty, the transformation of surplus into charity, the abbey's abundance becoming the poor man's relief. The Lauscher Codex and the Lauscher Arsnebuch speak to different needs, the general and the particular, the healthy and the sick, the whole community and the individual body. The smell of pea pottage has entirely dissipated now, the hall empty of its fragrance, the air turning neutral, waiting. The lectern is silent now, the platform deserted, the voice that filled the hall released into the afternoon, the reader himself perhaps at his own meal, the deferred consumption, the separate provision that enabled his service. You step into the cloister, the sun at its afternoon angle, the shadows lengthening toward evening, the day moving through its established course with the same unhurried certainty as the reading, the eating, the thanksgiving. The resonance of the reader's voice remains with you as you walk, the cadence continuing in the mind, the text becoming part of the inner speech that accompanies all movement, all perception, all the remaining hours until sleep and the return to morning, to prime, to the beginning again of the daily round. The draught from high windows is behind you now, the cloister air different, carrying garden smells, earth smells, the wider world beyond the refectory's discipline. The community has dispersed, each to his appointed task, the silence of the meal giving way to the necessary speech of work, the collaboration that requires words, the instruction, the report, the consultation. The swallowed sound was a temporary condition, a suspension, the silence itself a practice, a discipline, not the natural state, but the achieved one, the one that must be entered and maintained and released again with the same attention as any other element of the common life. You feel the transition in your own body, the adjustment from the contained stillness of the refectory to the open movement of the afternoon, the blood redistributing, the breath deepening, the senses expanding to meet a broader field. The reader's voice continues in your memory, the life of St. Benedict, the passage about the establishment of the common table, the original instruction that these men still follow, the thread of practice extending across centuries, across the deaths and replacements of countless brothers, the same words, the same gestures, the same silence. The wooden lectern creaks in memory, the reader shifts his weight, the Latin proceeds, the hour moves toward its completion, the thanksgiving, the dispersal, the continuation of the day. You walk on, the cloister arcade repeating its rhythm of light and shadow, the sun descending, the offices waiting, the evening coming with its own meal or its fast, its own reading or its silence, the whole structure of time shaped by these alternations, these provisions, these disciplines that carry the community through the years of its common endeavor. The bell for none sounds across the abbey at 3 in the afternoon, marking the 9th hour of the Roman day as the sun begins its long descent toward the western hills. You are standing in the cloister garth as the final notes fade, the geometric beds of the physic garden laid out before you in their winter dormancy. Around you, the stone arcade casts lengthening shadows across the gravel paths, and the air carries the damp smell of earth beneath straw mulch. The infirmarian walks between the raised beds, his sandals crunching softly on the frozen ground, his breath visible in the cold afternoon. The herbarium occupies the southeastern corner of the enclosure, sheltered by the infirmary wall that rises behind it in 2 stories of pale limestone. You watch as the infirmarian kneels beside a bed of sage, brushing away frost to reveal the silver-green leaves clustered beneath their protective covering. The sharp green smell of crushed rue still lingers from his morning inspection, when he tested the hardiness of that more delicate plant. The Lorcher Arsnebuch, completed around 800 CE, is the oldest preserved monastic medical text in the West, and the Abbey of Lorsch maintained this handbook as part of a healing tradition stretching across generations of Benedictine practice. The beds follow a precise order: square plots of fennel and centaury, rectangular rows of yarrow and feverfew, circular plantings of lavender and wormwood, all arranged according to the humoral properties recorded in the old manuscript. The visual order of the physic garden presents itself in these geometric patterns, each bed bordered by woven willow hurdles that have grayed with age and weather. The infirmarian moves methodically from one plot to the next, noting where the mulch has thinned, where mice have tunneled, where frost has penetrated too deeply. His fingers probe the soil with the tenderness of long acquaintance, the practical experience that no text alone can confer. The Benedictine rule requires care of the sick as if of Christ himself, and this garden exists to fulfill that commandment in its most material form. The infirmarian pauses at the bed of rue, its leaves dark and glossy, even in December, and you see him calculate the quantities that will be needed before spring growth resumes. The particular warmth of the infirmary, permitted fire where the main dormitory has none, will soon call him away from this outdoor work, but the garden demands its winter attention nonetheless. The Lorcher Arsnebuch prescribes sage, rue, fennel, and centaury among its remedies, and each must survive until the season turns. A novice approaches along the path, carrying a basket of dried stems from the storehouse, and the infirmarian directs him to replenish the mulch on the southern beds. You stand aside as they pass, the younger man's sandals slapping against the gravel, his breath coming faster in the cold air. The sky has shifted toward the pale amber of late afternoon, the sun low enough now to send horizontal light through the cloister arches. The stone tracery throws its familiar pattern across the dormant garden, each shadow edged sharp as a drawn line, each illuminated surface warmed to the color of old parchment. The infirmarian rises from his final inspection, brushing soil from his woolen habit, and turns toward the infirmary range that extends from the southern corner of the cloister. You follow at a distance, the path leading past the refectory and the kitchens, past the warming room where a thin thread of smoke rises from the chimney. The warming room was sometimes accessible to the infirm outside the winter season, a privilege granted to those whose bodies required more than the ordinary rigor of monastic life. The infirmary had its own chapel for private mass, and its own kitchen for special diets, and these separate provisions marked the boundary between the healthy community and those set apart for healing. The infirmary door stands open, and the heat within reaches you before you cross the threshold. The infirmarian enters first, his figure momentarily silhouetted against the interior glow, and you step after him into a space that moves to different rhythms than the main abbey. Monks in the infirmary were permitted to sleep in separate beds and rise later, their hours shaped by recovery rather than the canonical sequence of offices. The main ward extends to your left, a long chamber with windows glazed with thicker glass for warmth, the softer light falling across 6 narrow beds arranged along the walls. You stand near the entrance as the infirmarian approaches the second bed, where a young monk lies with his face flushed and his linen damp with sweat. The tertian fever has held him for 3 days now, its pattern established in the alternating bouts of heat and shaking that leave him exhausted in the intervals. The infirmarian places his palm against the patient's forehead, his touch lingering as he assesses the temperature, the moisture, the quality of the skin beneath his fingers. The Lorcher Arsnebuch contains recipes for fever, wounds, digestive complaints, and women's ailments, and the treatment of intermittent fever occupies several pages of the old handbook. The patient receives a decoction of feverfew and yarrow, and the infirmarian turns to the novice who waits by the hearth to prepare the draught. You move closer to observe the preparation. Dried yarrow flowers and feverfew leaves measured into a bronze vessel, water drawn from the infirmary's own copper boiler rather than the cold cistern, the mixture set to steep at the edge of the fire. The taste of honey and bitter herbs will follow, the honey to make the remedy palatable, the bitterness to speak of its potency. The patient stirs as the infirmarian speaks his name, his eyes opening with the confusion that fever brings, the struggle to place himself in time and space. He lifts the patient's head with one hand, supporting the neck while the novice brings the steaming cup, and you see the young monk's throat move as he swallows, the liquid dark as river water, its steam rising to moisten his face. The ward settles back into its afternoon quiet, the only sounds the settling of coals in the grate, the distant clatter of the infirmary kitchen, the occasional murmur from another bed where an older monk turns in his sleep. You walk the length of the chamber, the softer light of the windows, glazed with thicker glass for warmth, falling across your shoulders as you pass each frame. The smell of dried lavender and wormwood in the linen press reaches you from the far corner, where clean sheets are stored between layers of aromatic herbs to repel moth and preserve freshness. The infirmarian moves ahead of you, his destination the treatment room at the ward's eastern end, where a different patient awaits attention. A middle-aged brother sits on the wooden bench, his right hand extended on a cloth-covered board, his face composed in the resignation of one who has learned that monastic life offers no exemption from physical indignity. Another brother has a festering finger. The wound is washed and dressed with honey, and you watch as the infirmarian unwraps the previous day's dressing to reveal the swollen flesh, the angry line of infection tracing a path toward the wrist. The barber surgeon stands ready with his instruments, but this case has not yet advanced to the necessity of lancing, and the infirmarian proceeds with the simpler treatment himself. Warm water from the infirmary's boiler fills a basin, and the infirmarian soaks the affected finger, his movements deliberate as he works the softened scab free, the patient hissing once at the exposure of tender tissue. You observe the careful washing, the inspection of the wound's depth and direction, the judgment of whether the infection has begun to turn toward healing or continues its inward progress. The honey waits in a glazed jar, its amber surface catching the lamplight that supplements the afternoon's failing sun. The dressing applied, the finger wrapped in clean linen, the patient dismissed with instructions to return at Vespers for inspection. The infirmarian turns to his records. You stand at his shoulder as he writes, his script the compressed cursive of administrative habit, noting the treatment, the patient's response, the herbs consumed in the preparation. The infirmarian notes which herbs must be ordered from the south for the coming year, his list growing as he calculates the needs of a community that will not cease to ail simply because winter limits the garden's yield. Fennel seed from Provence, dried centauri from the Mediterranean coast, certain preparations that the local apothecaries cannot supply, all must be acquired through the Abbey's network of correspondents and merchants. The afternoon advances, the light through the treatment room's single window shifting from amber toward the grey that precedes evening. The metallic scent of blood will soon join these other odours, for the schedule holds its final procedure before the hour grows too late. A senior monk receives his seasonal bloodletting. The barber surgeon opens a vein in the arm, and this preventive measure belongs to the rhythm of monastic medicine as established as the canonical hours themselves. Bloodletting was performed seasonally, typically in spring and autumn as preventive medicine, but certain constitutions require additional treatment, and this brother's age and recurrent headaches have earned him a winter session. The patient reclines on the padded chair reserved for this purpose, his left arm extended and bound with linen strips above the elbow. The barber surgeon, a lay brother trained in this craft, examines the veins that stand raised beneath the constriction, selecting his point of entry with the judgment of long practice. You position yourself where the light falls clearly, the lamplight augmented now by a second candle as the natural illumination fades. The blade makes its quick incision, the dark blood wells into the waiting bowl, and the metallic scent rises to mingle with the herbs and honey that have preceded it. The flow continues, measured by the barber surgeon's experienced eye, neither too brief to be therapeutic nor so prolonged as to weaken the patient dangerously. The senior monk watches with the detachment of one who has submitted to this procedure perhaps 40 times before, his face pale but composed, his other hand resting on his breast in an attitude that suggests prayer or merely the conservation of strength. The infirmarian stands by, ready to intervene should the patient faint or the flow prove excessive, his attention divided between the bowl's filling and the patient's colour, his breathing, the steadiness of his gaze. The appropriate quantity drawn, the barber surgeon applies pressure with a pad of linen, the wound bound closed, the patient assisted to a resting bed where he will remain under observation until the evening meal. The infirmarian makes his notation, the date and quantity and patient's response, adding this record to the accumulation that documents the community's medical history. The Abbey of Lorsch maintained the Lorscher Arzneibuch as part of its medical tradition, and this living archive of practice extends and qualifies the written text, each generation adding its observations to the inherited wisdom. The treatment room empties, the instruments cleaned and stored, the blood disposed of according to the established custom. You follow the infirmarian through a connecting passage to the infirmary chapel, a small chamber set apart from the main ward by a short corridor and a door of painted wood. The infirmary chapel prepares for a private mass for those unable to walk to the main church, and you find the space already arranged, the altar clothed in green, the candles lit, though daylight still lingers in the western sky. A server in a white surplice arranges the vessels on the credence table, his movements economical and practiced, his youth evident in the quickness of his hands. The infirmarian takes his place among the small congregation that has gathered, those patients able to leave their beds, the staff of the infirmary, a few senior monks who prefer this intimate celebration to the longer walk and larger assembly of the abbey church. You stand at the rear, the softer light filtering through the chapel's single eastern window to illuminate the simple reredos with its carved figure of the healing Christ. The priest enters from the sacristy, an elderly monk whose gait has earned him his own place among the infirmary's regular congregation, and the brief service begins. You follow the familiar Latin, the responses made by the server in a voice still unbroken, the silence between prayers filled with the settling of the building, the distant sounds of the main abbey proceeding with its own none now completed, its own afternoon advancing toward evening. The consecration passes, the elevation of the host, the fraction and the communion distributed to those who approach the rail. The infirmarian receives, then assists one of his patients to the altar steps, supporting an arm that still trembles from the morning's fever. You watch the careful administration, the host placed on a tongue that the patient can barely extend, the wine offered in the small chalice reserved for those too weak to drink from the common cup. The taste of honey and bitter herbs seems distant now, replaced by the simpler taste of the sacrament, the thin wine and wheaten bread that sustain a different order of life. The Mass concludes, the thanksgiving brief, the congregation dispersing to their various occupations and restings. The infirmarian returns to the ward, his evening rounds awaiting, the inspection of each patient before the night settles over the abbey. You accompany him through the lengthening shadows, the particular warmth of the infirmary, permitted fire where the main dormitory has none, now supplemented by lamps and candles as darkness completes its winter victory over the afternoon. The beds lie in their rows, the patients in their various states of waking and sleeping, the whole separate world of the infirmary proceeding with its own rhythm, its own discipline, its own form of the monastic life. At the far end of the ward, the young man with the tertian fever has fallen into the deeper sleep that the feverfew and yarrow encourage, his breathing slower and more regular than before. The infirmarian places his hand once more on the forehead, finding the temperature moderated, the crisis perhaps turning toward resolution. The window glass has gone fully dark now, reflecting the interior lamplight rather than admitting any trace of sky. You stand at the ward centre, turning slowly to observe the whole space. The beds with their separate occupants, the hearth with its banked fire, the door leading to the kitchen where the special diets are prepared, the passage to the chapel where the evening mass has concluded. The infirmarian completes his notations by lamplight, his desk a corner of the ward partitioned by a painted screen that shows the patron saints of healing in faded colours. You approach to observe the script as it forms, the records that will guide tomorrow's treatments, next year's planting, the next generation's inherited knowledge. The monastic infirmarian was responsible for medical care, using the herbal and practical experience accumulated across decades of service, and this present holder of the office embodies that dual inheritance, the book learning and the hand knowledge, the text and the touch. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, composed medical and botanical works at the Rupertsberg convent, and though her writings belong to a different region and century, they share the same impulse that moves this infirmarian. The determination to understand the properties of growing things, to apply that understanding to the relief of suffering, to record the results for those who will follow. The Rupertsberg convent, founded by Hildegard in 1150, was located on the Rhine near Bingen, and the river valley that connected her community to this one has carried ideas as well as commerce, the slow diffusion of knowledge that characterizes the medieval centuries. The infirmarian rises, his day's work approaching completion, and moves to the door that leads to his own small cell within the infirmary range. You remain in the ward, the night settling around you, the sounds of the sleeping patients rising and falling in the darkness beyond the hearth's glow. The sharp green smell of crushed rue has faded from your own hands, though the memory of it persists, a sensory thread connecting the garden's winter mulch to this warm interior, the day's beginning to its end. The visual order of the physic garden, its geometric patterns, seems present even in absence, a mental architecture that organizes the infirmarian's knowledge and practice. A novice enters to tend the fire, his figure briefly blocking the hearth's light, his shadow enormous on the ceiling above. You watch him work, the careful placement of new coals, the adjustment of the screen that protects the ward from sparks, the final banking that will preserve warmth through the night hours. The smell of dried lavender and wormwood drifts across as he passes the storage corner, his youth and health evident in the ease of his movements, the unthinking strength that tends those who have temporarily lost their own. The abbey bell sounds somewhere in the distance, the hour marked for the main community, though the infirmary keeps its own modified time. None was sung at 3:00 p.m., marking the 9th hour of the Roman day, and that office now seems distant, the afternoon's progression from garden to ward to chapel complete in its arc. You walk slowly toward the door that leads back to the main cloister, the cold air of the passage reaching you before you cross the threshold, the transition from this warmed space to the ordinary temperature of monastic life. The cloister garth lies in darkness, the geometric beds invisible now, the stars overhead sharp in the winter clarity. You pause at the garden's edge, the gravel crunching beneath your feet, the memory of afternoon light still present in the body's sense of time and place. The herbarium was typically located in the cloister garth or adjacent enclosure, and this garden will endure through the frost months, its plants protected beneath their mulch, their roots slowly preparing for the spring that seems impossibly distant in this cold darkness. The infirmary windows glow behind you, the softer light visible from the garden center as a rectangle of amber against the stone wall. Within, the patients settle toward deeper sleep. The infirmarian rests in preparation for the night watch. The whole separate life of the sick and healing continues its rhythm. The infirmary was a separate building or range where dietary rules were relaxed, and this relaxation extends to the hours, the temperatures, the provisions that make possible the return to health, the eventual reintegration into the common life. You walk on, the cloister arcade repeating its familiar pattern though now in darkness, the pillars materializing as you approach, receding as you pass. The main church rises ahead, its own windows dark at this hour between offices, the community dispersed to their chapter house, their work rooms, their individual cells. The night deepens, the cold settles, the stars continue their slow wheeling overhead, and somewhere in the infirmary range a patient turns in his sleep. Another begins to dream. The infirmarian wakes for his scheduled round, the whole structure of care persisting through the darkness toward the dawn that will bring another day of herbs and wounds and fevers, and the slow accumulation of healing knowledge. You are standing in the nave of the Romanesque church at Lorsch, as the afternoon withdraws its last generosity from the stone. The rebuilt church, constructed in the 11th century, spreads above you with round arches and massive walls that have witnessed 3 generations of monks since the dedication. Around you, the air carries the particular blue of winter twilight seen through round-arched windows, a color that seems to belong neither to day nor to night, but to some intermediate kingdom of gradual surrender. The cold air moves across your face from the west, where the great bell, cast in the 11th century, will soon call the community to final assembly. You feel the cooling of stone walls as the day's stored heat dissipates, the masonry releasing its memory of morning warmth into the gathering darkness. The smell of oil lamps being lit, distinct from the day's candles, begins to thread through the space as the sacristan moves between the piers with his taper. The sacristan lights the lamps as shadows lengthen in the church, his movements following a path established by centuries of identical evenings. He reaches first for the lamp before the altar of St. Stephen, whose relics rest in the treasury at Corvée alongside those of St. Vitus, then moves methodically toward the choir stalls, where the abbot's seat awaits its distinguished occupant. The abbot's stall in choir was distinguished by canopy and placement at the eastern end, a position that gathered both spiritual authority and the practical advantage of earliest light through the morning windows. You watch the visual pattern of moving shadows from multiple lamps in the vaulted space, each flame casting its own geometry against the ribs and responds, so that the architecture itself seems to breathe with alternating darkness and gold. The sacristan pauses at the westwork at Corvée, where the upper chapel awaits its possible royal visitors, though tonight no king has come to seek private prayer in that elevated space. Vespers, the evening prayer, was sung as light failed, between 4:00 and 6:00 p.m. depending on season, and this December evening has compressed the interval to its briefest span. The community gathers for Vespers, the day's work visible in stained habits and earth-worn hands, the gardeners still carrying the clay of the kitchen herbs upon their fingers, the scribes showing the ink that no amount of washing fully removes from the cuticle. You are standing at the crossing now as they enter in procession, the antiphon for the day already announced by the precentor's soft intonation. The westwork at Corvée, with its upper chapel, was used for private prayer and possibly for royal visitors. But here at Lorsch, the Western Mass contains only the faithful community gathering as the natural order completes another revolution. The lamps were lit in church for Vespers, marking the formal end of natural light, and you perceive this threshold in the changed quality of illumination, the human flame now asserting its small jurisdiction against the vast withdrawal outside. The Magnificat rises as the last light enters through the west windows of the westwork, the cantor beginning Mary's hymn in the 8th mode, that reciting tone which seems to suspend time rather than measure it. Vespers includes the Magnificat, the hymn of Mary, sung with antiphons proper to the day, and today's antiphon speaks of the root of Jesse, the winter theme appropriate to the season's expectation. The sound of the Magnificat in modal chant, settling into the evening, fills the stone vessel of the church with vibrations that the walls have learned across decades of identical repetition. You feel the music not only through your ears, but through the soles of your feet where the floor transmits the bass notes, through your chest where the sustained vowels create sympathetic resonance. The westwork contains frescoes from the 9th century depicting the virtues and the life of Christ, and though you cannot see them clearly in this failing light, you know they preside above the chant as silent witnesses to its continuity. The community sings without self-consciousness, the words emerging from mouths that have shaped them since childhood in some cases, since young manhood in others. The Benedictine rule prescribes examination of conscience before sleep, and already this examination begins in the unguarded faces turned toward the cantor, the brief absences that pass across expressions, as some brother follows some thread of private recollection. You notice the infirmarian standing slightly apart from his usual companions, his mind perhaps still with the patient who turned in his sleep as the stars wheeled overhead in the previous darkness. The treasury at Corvée held relics including those of St. Vitus and St. Stephen, and the mention of Stephen in today's liturgy reminds certain brothers of that distant Saxon house where they once studied or visited, where they once stood in winter twilight seen through round-arched windows not unlike these. The Magnificat concludes, the antiphon repeated, the minor doxology sealing the psalmody as water seals a vessel. After Vespers, the community might process to the chapter house for the martyrology reading, and tonight this follows the accustomed pattern, the brothers moving in 2s and 3s through the cold cloister where the day's last warmth has fled entirely into the sky. You walk among them, the smell of oil lamps still present in your clothing from the nave's atmosphere. The Romanesque church at Lorsch, rebuilt in the 11th century, had round arches and massive walls, and these same qualities describe the chapter house where the abbot now takes his seat beneath the simple vaulting. The martyrology is read, tomorrow's saints, and any anniversaries of deaths in the community. The reader's voice assumes the monotone reserved for this catalogue, the names and places and manners of dying accumulating their own poetry of repetition. You hear of a bishop burned in Persia, of monks slaughtered by Vikings on an island monastery, of a deacon stoned in a city whose name the reader pronounces with the flattening of Latin case endings. Then the local names emerge, the brothers who have died at Lorsch across the decades, since the great bell first summoned them to offices they would not complete. The period between Vespers and Compline allowed for private reading or conversation in some houses, and here the abbot permits brief exchange after the martyrology's solemn conclusion, the brothers dispersing into the cloister's covered walk with the loosened gait of men whose formal obligations have momentarily released them. After Vespers, monks walk the cloister in permitted conversation, discussing a text or a practical matter. You find yourself beside two conversi, lay brothers who manage the agricultural affairs, their speech concerned with the storage of the recent grain harvest against the frost that has hardened the ground for a week now. The cooling of stone walls as the day's stored heat surrounds their practical words with the acoustic of diminishing energy, the cloister's arches returning their voices with a slight hollowness that suggests the hour's lateness. Another pair passes speaking of a disputed reading in Bede's commentary, their Latin tags emerging with the ease of long familiarity, the younger repeating a phrase 3 times as if to anchor it in memory before the night's dissolution. You feel the gradual hush as conversation ceases and brothers prepare for the final hour, the voices dropping away like the last leaves of autumn that the wind has not yet claimed. A monk borrows a wax tablet from the armarius for private notes before sleep, his stylus scratching in the corner where the lamp's reach grows uncertain. The library was closed and secured after Vespers by the armarius, and you observe this officer making his rounds now, the keys heavy at his belt, his inspection of the reading desks methodical and unhurried. The armarius accepts the tablet borrower with a gesture that acknowledges the privilege, the wax surface being smoothed and prepared for the night's private composition. You imagine the notes that might follow, a correction to the day's transcription, a verse of some devotional poem, the record of a dream from the previous night that seemed to carry significance. The kitchen prepares a light evening meal, the collatio of bread and drink, and you follow the scent of baking that has somehow persisted through the offices to the refectory's secondary door. The taste of the evening collatio, dry bread, no spread with small beer, awaits the brothers who will gather in silence or in permitted speech, depending on the custom of the house. At Lorsch, the collatio allows quiet exchange, the day's final nourishment taken with the relaxed posture that the rule permits in this least formal of communal meals. You receive your portion from the kitchener's hand, the bread's crust still holding warmth from the oven's depth, the beer's thin gravity appropriate to a stomach that will soon lie horizontal for the long hours of night. The visual pattern of moving shadows from multiple lamps in the vaulted space continues here, the refectory's lamps fewer than the church's, but sufficient to make each face a study of illuminated and concealed. The great bell at Lorsch has not yet sounded for Compline, and this interval stretches with the elasticity of time that knows itself to be bounded. The particular blue of winter twilight seen through round-arched windows has completed its transition to absolute black, the stars visible in the narrow strips of sky between the building's silhouettes. You stand in the cloister's open angle, the cold air moving across your face from the garden where the herbs lie dormant under their mulch, where the paths that the infirmarian walked in summer now carry only frost's irregular patterning. The porter prepared to lock the main gates after Compline, admitting no one until morning, and you find him in his lodge testing the heavy keys, his vigilance already assuming the night's posture though the bell has not yet called. The night office of Matins would come in 6 hours, beginning the cycle again, and this knowledge hangs in the air like moisture before rain, the cycle's inevitability both comfort and mild burden. You watch the porter's preparations, the bar laid ready for the gates securing, the small fire in his lodge that will sustain him through the hours of necessary waking. The smell of oil lamps being lit reaches even here, the sacristan's earlier work still traceable in the atmosphere's layered composition. You return to the church as the first signal for Compline begins, a soft striking of wood upon wood rather than the great bell that will conclude the gathering. The community reassembles with the changed demeanor of men who have eaten, conversed, prepared for sleep, who now approach the final compression of the day's consciousness. You hear the words as from a distance, your own consciousness participating in the general softening that the hour induces, the gradual hush as conversation ceases and brothers prepare for the final hour, now complete in every visible face. Compline ends with the blessing, the antiphon to the Blessed Virgin, the extinguishing of lights that follows the Nunc Dimittis as darkness follows certainty. You climb the dormitory stairs with the others, the wood familiar under your palm, the smell of sleeping bodies and woolen blankets gradually replacing the church's incense and oil. The great bell at Lorsch does not sound again, its silence now as significant as its earlier summons, the community released from its jurisdiction until the Matins hour. You find your place in the long dormitory, the straw mattress yielding its slight sound as you lower yourself, the blankets weight welcome against the cold that penetrates even these thick walls. You hear the breathing of brothers already asleep, the occasional shift of straw, the distant bark of some dog in the outer court responding to the frost's contraction of familiar sounds. The smell of oil lamps being lit has entirely dissipated, replaced by the dormitory's compound odor of wool, straw, male bodies in long proximity, the faint sweetness of the floor's recent washing with lye. The gradual hush as conversation ceases and brothers prepare for the final hour has achieved its absolute form, the silence now so complete that your own breathing seems an interruption, a sound that the silence tolerates but does not require. You turn upon your side, the straw adjusting to your new posture, the blanket's edge finding the precise balance between exposure and constraint that the cold demands. You are standing at the threshold of the church as the last notes of Vespers fade into the stone around you. The brothers rise from their stalls in unison, and the shuffle of sandals against the nave floor marks the brief interval before Compline begins. This is the hour of completion, the final office of the day, and the darkness outside has already claimed the cloister garden and the Scriptorium windows. You move with the community toward your appointed place, and the cold air from the unglazed west windows moves across your face as you settle into the stall. The church holds no lamps now, only the sanctuary lamp pulsing its small red witness above the altar, and the faces around you are dimmed to shapes of grey wool and lowered eyes. The abbot takes his place, and the antiphon rises without accompaniment, the voices threadbare with fatigue, yet precise in their ancient cadence. Compline's brevity is its mercy, a swift enclosure of the waking hours within the arms of prayer. You hear the Nunc Dimittis begin, that canticle of release. Now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. The words have been sung here at Lorsch for more than 2 centuries, and they will be sung tomorrow, and the day after, and in every monastery where Benedict's rule still governs the hours. The rule specifies that monks should sleep clothed, with girdle and knife, ready to rise, and this readiness for departure permeates even the melody, a letting go that is also a preparation. Around you, the merchants of exhaustion from the day's labor unload their final cargoes, the minds that have bent over manuscripts and the hands that have guided the plough through abbey fields, now surrendering their vigilance to the promise of rest. A final collect for protection through the night concludes the sung prayer, and the Amen falls soft as ash upon the stones. The abbot makes the sign of the cross over the assembly, and the community processes to the dormitory, sandals whispering on stone. You are walking now through the cloister passage, and the night air carries the last warmth of the day from the south wall, where sun has stored itself in the masonry. The dormitory at Lorsch was a large hall with individual beds or alcoves, and you find your own narrow space marked by the faint bulk of straw mattress and wooden frame. Each monk finds his place, removes outer garments, and lies down in the habit. The wool of your tunic retains the day's heat, the girdle still binds your waist, and the small knife at your side presses against your hip as the rule demands, a reminder that sleep is never entirely without vigilance. The particular quality of silence in a building where speech is forbidden begins to assert itself even before the formal prohibition takes effect. You hear the sound of many men settling into straw mattresses simultaneously, the creak of rope supports, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the suppressed exhalations of bodies lowering themselves into horizontal rest. The smell of wool, straw, and male bodies in close proximity rises from the collective warmth of the hall, a dense human scent that will permeate the darkness until morning. The cold air from unglazed or loosely glazed windows moves across faces, and you turn slightly toward the wall to shield your cheek from its persistent touch. The seasons affected sleep patterns more dramatically than in modern life. 16 hours of darkness in December, and tonight in this winter season, the blackness outside presses against the openings with a palpable weight, as if the night itself were a substance seeking entry. The abbot's footsteps pass slowly down the central aisle. You do not see him, but the particular rhythm of his stride, slightly heavier on the left from an old injury sustained in his youth at Fulda, identifies him unmistakably in the darkness. He makes a final circuit of the dormitory, checking that all are present and lights extinguished, and you sense his pause at the foot of your bed, the brief suspension of breath as he verifies your presence among the recumbent forms. Then he moves onward, and the small light he carries, the last permitted flame, withdraws its influence from the periphery of your vision. The light is extinguished. The absolute darkness of the dormitory, no light permitted after Compline, folds itself around you like a thick cloth, and for a moment the loss of visual orientation produces a mild vertigo, as if the floor itself were tilting toward some unseen depth. The great silence, silentium magnum, began after Compline and lasted until morning, and you enter it now without transition, the prohibition against speech descending like a second darkness upon the first. You lie upon your back at first, as the rule recommends meditation on one's death before sleep as preparation for the final accounting, and you attempt this discipline with the sincerity that repetition has not yet entirely eroded. The thought of death in this hour does not provoke fear, but rather a gentle loosening of attachment, a rehearsal for that greater letting go that the nunc dimittis has already sung into the evening air. Your breathing slows to match the respiration of the brother in the next alcove, and you become aware of the collective rhythm of the dormitory, dozens of chests rising and falling in approximate synchrony, as if the hall itself were a single organism settling into its nocturnal metabolism. The distant hoot of an owl, audible now that all human sound has ceased, reaches you from the abbey woods beyond the fish ponds. The bird calls 3 times, pauses, calls again, and its territorial announcement seems to measure the silence rather than interrupt it. You turn onto your side, and the straw beneath your shoulder compresses with a faint rustle that would have been inaudible an hour ago, but now sounds distinct as a footfall. The half-dream state before true sleep descends gradually, a softening of the edges of consciousness that you recognize without fully observing, for observation would restore the wakefulness you are relinquishing. The night office of Matins would interrupt sleep after approximately 4 hours, and this knowledge lies somewhere beneath your deliberate thoughts, a submerged certainty that permits you to surrender to the darkness with the trust of one who has been awakened thus 1,000 times before. The Lorcher Arsnebuch includes recipes for sleep-promoting draughts, though these were rarely needed, and you recall without full waking the infirmarian's preparation of valerian and hop flowers for a brother troubled by restless nights. The remedies gather dust in the abbey's pharmacopoeia, for the labour of the hours is itself a soporific more reliable than any decoction, and the body that has risen at midnight for matins and laboured through lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, and vespers requires little assistance in finding its rest. You feel the weight of your own limbs as evidence of this, the legs that have walked the fields and the hands that have held the pen now sinking into the mattress with a gravity that seems to increase moment by moment. The church was left unlocked for private prayer, though unlit except for the sanctuary lamp, and somewhere in that vast darkness, the small flame continues its vigil, a point of reference for any soul wakeful with spiritual urgency. Monks who rose for private prayer did so in the side chapels, not disturbing the dormitory, and you imagine without seeing the faint figure that might even now be moving through the nave, guided by memory of 1,000 traversals, finding the Lady Chapel or the Chapel of St. Nazarius, where the abbey's founder lies in his stone repose. The prior or his deputy remained wakeful to deal with emergencies during the night, and you know that in the prior's lodging a lamp still burns, a small circle of permitted light where authority maintains its readiness against fire, against illness, against the sudden crisis that the rule anticipates without specifying. The first snores mingle with the distant sound of the Weser or Rhine, and the silence deepens. You cannot distinguish which river speaks in this hour, for both flow through the abbey's domain, the Weser closer, the Rhine a day's journey westward, yet their combined murmur reaches you as a single continuous note beneath the intermittent percussion of sleeping breath. The snores vary in character, the reedy whistle of the old, the guttural suspension of the heavy-limbed, the almost musical fluctuation of the choir master whose nasal passages have troubled him since youth. These sounds do not disturb the silence, but rather inhabit it, proving its depth by the smallness of their intrusion. The cold air from the windows continues its passage across your face, and you pull the rough blanket higher, tucking its edge beneath your shoulder with a movement that has become automatic through years of repetition. The blanket's wool retains the accumulated scent of previous users, decades of sleepers whose names have passed into the abbey's chronicles or into oblivion, their physical presence persisting only in this faint olfactory residue. You breathe it in, and it merges with the dense human atmosphere of the dormitory that no season entirely disperses. The cycle of hours would resume with matins, completing the liturgical day that had begun 22 hours earlier, and this great circle turns in your mind as a slow wheel, the offices like beads upon an endless cord. You have lived within this cycle for years beyond ready counting, and its return is as certain as the rivers, as the owl's nocturnal patrol, as the darkness itself that will yield only to the imperceptible brightening of the eastern sky. The bell for the night office was struck softly, to wake without startling, and you anticipate its sound already in the pre-dream state, the wooden board meeting its striker with a muffled impact that will penetrate your sleep as a summons without violence, a voice that speaks without words. The absolute darkness of the dormitory has become familiar now, no longer the vertiginous absence it first seemed, but a positive presence, a medium in which you float as a fish floats in deep water. You hear the distant hoot of an owl once more, closer now, or perhaps merely more audible as your consciousness thins towards sleep, and its call seems to come from within rather than without, a sound that occupies the space between your ears as much as the night air beyond the windows. The abbey's watchman or porter remained on duty through the night at the gatehouse, and you imagine him in his shelter beside the western entrance, wrapped in his cloak against the cold, listening to the same silence that envelops you, yet bound to external vigilance while you are released into internal darkness. His presence at the boundary of the enclosure corresponds to the prior's wakefulness within it, layers of guardianship that permit the community its unguarded rest. In this abundance of night, the watchman's solitude extends beyond what summer would permit, his hours of waiting multiplied by the long arc of winter stars. You are sinking now, the half-dream state before true sleep becoming indistinguishable from the sleep it anticipates. You feel the rule's requirements as distant pressures against your body, the girdle a faint constriction, the knife a small hardness at your side, the habit itself a second skin that will require no donning when the board strikes. The cold air from the windows moves across your face with a regularity that has become almost tidal, in and out with the breathing of the dormitory, and you no longer distinguish its touch from the movement of your own respiration. The first snores have multiplied, deepened, merged into a continuous substrate of sound upon which your own approaching unconsciousness floats. The distant sound of the Weser or Rhine persists, a lower frequency beneath the human percussion, and the silence deepens until the board strikes for Matins, though that strike belongs to a future that your present self cannot yet inhabit. Compline's completion is also yours, the office's brief perfection echoed in the longer perfection of sleep that now receives you. You move within the great silence as within a river, carried toward the shallows of Matins and the deeper waters of the night's remaining darkness. You are aware of the brother beside you turning in his alcove, a faint shift of straw and fabric, and this movement seems to belong to your own body, the boundary between self and other dissolving in the darkness, as it sometimes does in these liminal moments. The silence of the dormitory has become the silence of your own interior, the space in which thoughts arise and disperse without the obligation of speech to fix them in form. The distant hoot of an owl comes once more, and you note it without noting, the mind's last flutter of attention before it folds upon itself. Your alcove is your world now, the wooden walls that separate you from your brothers becoming the limits of consciousness itself. The abbot's passage has left a trace in the darkness, a disturbance that settles slowly like sediment in still water. The knowledge of Matins, held somewhere below the threshold of deliberate thought, permits you to surrender entirely, to abandon the slight tension of anticipation that might otherwise resist the descent. In your pre-sleep state, you rehearse the bell's sound, not as expectation, but as memory of all previous awakenings, a familiarity that guarantees the future's gentle arrival. The prior's vigilance is your release, the permission to be unwakeful, to trust the community's structure to maintain itself without your participation. You imagine the sanctuary lamp as the last visible thing in the abbey's night, a point of warmth in the vast cold darkness of nave and transept and choir. The silent movements of any private prayer are part of the silence now, indistinguishable from the settling of beams, the contraction of stone in falling temperature, the infinite small adjustments of a building releasing the day's heat into the winter air. The cold air from the windows moves across your face, and you no longer feel it as cold, the temperature differential between skin and atmosphere having diminished as your metabolism slows toward its nocturnal minimum. In this abundance of darkness, you are a small thing, a brief interruption of wakefulness within the greater blackness that will persist long after Matins has come and gone, long after the cycle of hours has resumed its turning and the liturgical day has completed its circle. This completion is also a beginning, the eternal return that structures monastic time against the linear passage of secular history. You are almost gone now, the half-dream state having become the sleep itself, the knowledge of the bell held in abeyance like the breath held between inhalation and exhalation. The first snores mingle with the distant sound of the Weser or Rhine, and the silence deepens, and you are no longer distinct from this mingling. Your own breath contributing to the collective respiration of the hall, your own slight movements part of the settling that has long since ceased to be audible as separate event. The absolute darkness of the dormitory is the darkness of your own closed eyes, the darkness of the mind's retreat from the world of visible things into the deeper darkness of dream. In your final moment of near wakefulness, you smile at the thought of the Arsnebuch's remedies, the body's own pharmacy having proven sufficient, the labor of the hours having prepared you more reliably than any herbal preparation. The distant hoot of an owl comes one final time, or perhaps you dream it, the sound entering your sleep as a native element of the dream landscape, rather than an intrusion from the external world. The great silence finds its fullest expression now, the silence of the dormitory completing itself in the silence of your sleep. The rule recommends meditation on one's death before sleep as preparation for the final accounting, and in this dissolution of consciousness, you approach the rehearsal prescribed, a small death that prefigures the greater death and prepares the soul for its final letting go. The abbot's footsteps pass slowly down the central aisle, though this is memory now, or dream, the abbot long since retired to his own rest, the dormitory given over entirely to the breathing of its inhabitants. In this darkness you are a small warmth, a brief flame of metabolism against the greater cold, your heat contributing infinitesimally to the collective warmth of the dormitory, the shared atmosphere that sustains each individual in his separate alcove. The first snores have become the continuous music of sleep, the dormitory's nocturnal hymn, and the silence deepens until the board strikes for matins, though that strike belongs to a future that your sleeping self will receive without anticipation, the bell's soft impact penetrating your unconsciousness as a summons from a depth you cannot now imagine. Compline's completion is complete in you, the office's brief form expanded into the larger form of the night, the darkness, the silence, the waiting for the dawn that will bring another day of hours and offices, and the slow accumulation of prayer and labor, and the knowledge that sustains both. This completion waits for you in the darkness, patient as the rivers, as the seasons, as the rule itself that has governed these hours for centuries beyond your brief participation. You sleep, and the abbey sleeps around you, and the watchman at the gatehouse maintains his solitary vigil, and the sanctuary lamp burns its small red witness in the empty church, and the owl completes its patrol of the abbey woods, and the darkness holds all these things in its unbroken embrace, until the soft strike of wood upon wood shall begin again the turning of the hours, the return of wakefulness, the resumption of the prayer that never truly ceases, but only changes its form, from the sung to the silent, from the communal to the solitary, from the conscious to the dream, and back again, through all the nights that the Abbey of Lorsch has known, and all the nights that remain before its stones, shall finally surrender their warmth to the greater darkness that waits beyond all completion.